The water is black tonight. Not dark, not shadowed, but truly and completely black, the way deep things are black when no light has ever touched them from below. You're standing at the edge of something old, and the channel wind moves through you rather than past you, carrying with it the smell of brine and cold iron, and distances you could not measure even if you tried. There is no moon. There is only the flat pewter sky above the Goodwin Sands and the sound of water moving over sand in the old, patient way that water has moved here for 10,000 years. The Goodwins do not announce themselves. They are simply there, 4 miles of treacherous shallow ground lying just below the surface at low tide, waiting with a patience that has nothing to do with malice and everything to do with time. Sailors call them the ship swallower. They have been calling them that since before anyone thought to write the name down. There are those who say that more ships have been lost to the Goodwin Sands than to any other single stretch of water on the surface of the earth. The sand swallows them whole, the way good earth swallows a seed, except nothing grows from what goes into the Goodwins. What goes in stays in. What stays in is kept. Tonight, in the particular darkness you have settled into, something is moving at the edge of sight. Not fast, not slow, moving the way a thing moves when it has all the time in the world, because time stopped meaning what it means to you a very long time ago. It has 3 masts, it has lanterns at the bow and stern, and their light is the yellow of old bone, and it is sailing a course that no living ship would sail tonight, in this wind, across this water. Sailors say that once every 50 years a doomed schooner sails the Goodwin Sands again, crewed by men who drowned 2 centuries ago. They say that if you see her, you will know her by the light of those lanterns, and by the silence that surrounds her despite the wind, despite the waves. They say she's still on her wedding voyage. They say she will always be on her wedding voyage. They say she will never arrive. Let yourself settle now into the telling of it. The water is black, the sand is patient, the ship is out there in the dark, and you have all the time in the world to hear how it all began. You are somewhere between waking and drifting, in that warm country where the edges of things go soft and the body grows heavy, and the mind begins to loosen its grip on the particular concerns of the day. You are safe, you are warm. And the story that is coming to you now is very old, older than any of your worries, older than most of the buildings you have ever stood inside, and it carries with it a quality that very old stories always carry, which is the quality of having been told so many times that the telling itself has become a kind of truth, worn smooth and certain as riverstone. The year that matters most to our story is 1748. The King of England then was George II, a man who preferred Hanover to London and was known more for his military campaigns than for any particular warmth of personality. The sea trade was everything. Coal came down from Newcastle, wool went out to the continent, timber and pitch and saltfish and spices moved in great slow caravans of sail, across waters that had no reliable charts and no reliable weather and no reliable mercy. The English Channel in 1748 was a different kind of place from the channel you might cross today on a ferry, with a warm drink and a window seat. It was narrow enough to see France on a clear day, and that proximity was deceptive, because it contained some of the most dangerous water in the northern seas. The tides ran fast and strange. Fog came down without warning. Sandbanks shifted. The Goodwin Sands had been swallowing ships for centuries, and they were not done swallowing ships yet. Into this world came the Lady Lovibond, a 3-masted schooner of respectable size and unremarkable appearance, the kind of ship that was built to carry things from one place to another, and to do so repeatedly and without drama. She was not a warship. She was not a vessel of exploration. She was a working ship, and her whole character was defined by that practicality, by the plain ambition of getting cargo from here to there in one piece. But on the first day of February 1748, the Lady Lovibond was not carrying cargo. She was carrying something far more delicate and far more combustible. She was carrying a wedding party, and at the centre of that wedding party was a young woman in her finest dress, and a young captain who had, against all maritime tradition and a good deal of common sense, brought his new bride aboard for what he believed would be a memorable and romantic voyage down the English Channel. His name was Captain Simon Reed. Her name, before she became Mrs. Reed, was not recorded with any consistency across the various accounts of this story, and perhaps that is fitting, because the story that grew up around the Lady Lovibond would eventually swallow the precise details of the people involved and replace them with something larger and less specific, something more like legend and less like biography. What we know is that she was young. What we know is that Captain Reed was in love with her in the extravagant and slightly reckless way that young men in love sometimes are. And what we know, because the story insists on it, is that there was a third person aboard whose presence would determine everything that followed. His name was John Rivers. He was the first mate of the Lady Lovibond. He had served under Captain Reed for some years, and he was, according to every version of this story that has ever been told, in love with the same woman that Captain Reed had just married. Settle yourself a little deeper now. The story is just beginning to take its shape. The ship is in the harbour at Gravesend, riding at anchor in the Thames estuary, and the wedding party is coming aboard, and the lanterns are lit, and the music is playing, and John Rivers is watching from the stern with an expression that no one at the party is paying attention to, because weddings have a way of narrowing everyone's attention to the centre of joy and away from the edges where the darker feelings live. If you enjoy listening to sleepy atmospheric history stories like this one, consider subscribing. New stories arrive every week, and the next one will be waiting for you when you return. Gravesend in the winter of 1748 was a town that smelled of mud and rope, and the particular saltwater freshness that estuary towns always carry, that mixture of river and sea that is not quite either one, a brackish in-between quality that gets into the wood of buildings and the wool of coats and the hair of people who live there long enough. The Thames at Gravesend was wide and grey and busy even in winter, because the sea trade did not stop for cold. It only slowed a little, the way a great river slows in February without ever quite stopping. The Lady Lovibond had been provisioned for a voyage to Oporto in Portugal. This was not an unusual run. English ships went to Oporto regularly, carrying wool and manufactured goods, returning with the dark, fortified wine that the English had developed a deep affection for after the wars with France had made French wine too expensive and too politically inconvenient to drink in polite company. Port wine was good business, port wine was reliable business, and the Lady Lovibond, before she became a ghost story, was a reliable business ship. What made the first day of February unusual was the cargo she was not carrying. Captain Reed had arranged, in the particular way that a man newly married and still dizzy with it arranges things, for the Lady Lovibond to sail without her commercial cargo on this particular leg of the voyage. He had told himself that it was a matter of scheduling, that the cargo would meet them at a later port, that the timing simply worked out this way. What it actually was a wedding gift to himself and to his new wife, the gift of an uncrowded ship, of space and time and the open sea on a February morning that was cold but clear. The wedding had taken place a day earlier in the town, in the small church near the waterfront where sailors and their families had been married and buried for longer than the current building had been standing. It was not an elaborate ceremony. Captain Reed was not a man of great social standing, though he was a man of some means, and his wife came from a family that was comfortable rather than wealthy, the kind of family that kept good furniture and knew the right people without quite being the right people themselves. The ceremony was attended by a small group of friends and relatives, and there was a dinner afterward at the better of the 2 inns the town offered, and there was wine, and there was music, and there were the usual speeches. John Rivers was at the dinner. He sat near the far end of the table, and he drank his wine with a steadiness that could have been either a sign of celebration or a sign of something else entirely, and no one was watching him closely enough to know which. He had been invited because he was the first mate, and not inviting the first mate of your ship to your wedding dinner, when the wedding dinner was happening in the same town where the ship was moored, would have been a social slight of the kind that created lasting difficulties in working relationships. So he was invited, and he came, and he sat near the far end of the table and he watched the captain dance with his new wife, and whatever he was thinking he kept it behind his eyes where it would not be seen. The morning of departure was cold and still. Frost had hardened the mud at the waterfront into something almost respectable, almost solid, and it crunched under the boots of the porters who carried the passengers' luggage aboard. The wedding party was smaller than it might sound. There was Captain Reed and his new wife. There were her 2 sisters and their husbands. There were 2 family friends who had been promised a pleasant sea voyage as a thank you for attending the ceremony. And there was a handful of crew, the minimum necessary to sail the Lady Lovibond with competence if not with luxury. John Rivers was already aboard when the wedding party arrived at the quay. He had been there since before dawn, going over the rigging and the stores in the methodical way that first mates do before any voyage, that systematic examination of everything that might go wrong and everything that might need to be done, the mental rehearsal of a voyage before the voyage begins. It was the work that experienced sailors do almost without thinking, the way experienced cooks taste as they go, and experienced builders check their measurements twice. And it was also, that particular morning, a way of not being at the quay when the wedding party arrived. He heard them coming before he saw them. He heard the laughter and the voices and the particular lightness that newlyweds carry with them. That quality of existing in a world that is slightly better than the ordinary world, a world where everything is going well and is expected to continue going well. He heard the captain's voice, easy and confident and happy, and he heard the voice of the new Mrs. Reed, and then he heard her laugh, and the laugh was like a bell, clean and clear in the cold February air. Rivers kept his eyes on the rigging. He had nothing to say that would be welcome to hear. He had only the work, and the work was sufficient, and the work was his. He told himself this with the particular forcefulness of a man who is trying to convince himself of something he already knows but finds difficult to accept. The work was sufficient. The voyage was a voyage. The ship was a ship. He was the first mate, and the first mate's job was to sail the ship, and to follow the captain's orders and to keep the cargo and the crew and the vessel intact from one port to the next. The Lady Lovibond slipped her moorings at a little after 9 in the morning, when the tide was beginning to ebb and the conditions for leaving the Thames estuary were as good as they were likely to be on a February day. The pilot came aboard to take her out through the estuary channels, as was customary, guiding her through the shoals and the sandbars and the traffic of other vessels, with the precise, unhurried competence of a man who had done this particular thing many hundreds of times. The ship moved out into the grey water slowly at first, and then with more purpose as the sails caught the wind that was coming from the northeast, cold and steady. Below decks, in the captain's cabin, Mrs. Reed was settling into the reality of being at sea for the first time. She had been aboard ships before, briefly, in harbour, but this was different. This was the ship moving, the ship alive under her, the slight and constant adjustment of the deck beneath her feet that sea voyages demand of those who are new to them. It was not unpleasant. It was simply something she had not expected. This aliveness of the vessel, this sense of something cooperating with forces larger than itself. On deck, Captain Reed was where he always was when his ship was moving, at the helm or close to it, watching the water ahead and the sails above and the behaviour of the vessel in a way that was so deeply habitual that it barely registered as watching. He had been sailing since he was a boy. He knew this type of ship the way a musician knows a familiar instrument, not by thinking about it, but by feeling it, by the 1,000 small adjustments that the body makes without consulting the mind. And John Rivers was forward, at the bow, watching the grey water part before them as the Thames opened into the wider world of the estuary, and the estuary opened into the channel. He was watching the water, but he was not seeing the water. He was seeing something inside his own head, something he had been looking at for weeks, for months perhaps, something that had grown there quietly and without his permission, the way certain kinds of feeling grow, the way certain kinds of pain grow, which is slowly and in the dark and without any moment when you could have stopped it. The coast of Kent appeared to the south. The white cliffs were grey in the winter light, the way white things go grey when the light is not right, when the sun is low and diffuse and more suggestion than substance. The seabirds were out in numbers despite the cold, working the water below the cliffs with that mechanical urgency that seabirds have, the total commitment of a creature whose only thought is the next fish, and the next, and the next. The ship moved past them, and the birds paid no attention to the ship. Somewhere to the southeast, invisible from this distance, invisible from any distance unless you knew exactly what you were looking at and exactly where to look, lay the Goodwin Sands. They were not visible. They were not audible. They were simply there in the water and in the charts and in the minds of anyone who sailed these waters with any regularity, a fact of the geography as familiar and as taken for granted as the tides themselves. Captain Reed knew they were there. Every sailor in the English Channel knew they were there. It was not a secret. It was not a danger you could fail to know about if you spent any time at all on these waters. What Captain Reed did not know, what no one on the Lady Lovibond knew, was that the danger was not coming from outside the ship. The danger was already aboard. It had been aboard since before the ship left the quay. It was standing at the bow in the cold February air with its hands on the rail and its eyes on the water and its thoughts in a place that had nothing to do with navigation or cargo or the efficient execution of a winter voyage to Portugal. The afternoon progressed as February afternoons do on the Channel, with the light declining earlier than you expect, the sky going from pale grey to a deeper grey to something that is not yet dark but is no longer quite light, that English winter half-light that seems designed specifically to make distances ambiguous and edges uncertain. The coast of Kent had receded to the south, and was now a line rather than a feature, a low distinction between the grey of the sea and the grey of the sky that would not be visible much longer. The ship was in the Channel proper now, in the water that belonged equally to England and France, and to neither of them, the water that was between. The crew who were not on watch had gone below. The ship was quieter than it had been during the day, the noise of work replaced by the background noise of a vessel under sail at night, which is a different and more intimate sound. The creak of the rigging adjusting to the wind, the sound of the hull working in the small but continuous way that wooden hulls work, the low percussion of the sea against the bow. These sounds were the sounds of everything being as it should be, which is also the sounds that accompany disaster in its early stages, before the thing that is wrong has become large enough to change the character of the sounds. The temperature was dropping. This was expected. February nights on the Channel were cold, and the cold that came in off the North Sea was the particular cold of those latitudes, the cold that had crossed flat water for hundreds of miles without anything to interrupt it or warm it, a clean, merciless cold that found the gaps in clothing, and the gaps in planning, and the gaps in the psychological preparation of people who had not been to sea in winter before. The wedding guests below would have been glad of the cabin's warmth. The crew on watch would have been stamping their feet. Let that understanding settle gently, the way understanding settles when you are close to sleep, when the mind accepts things without argument, when the body is already beginning its long, slow descent into rest. The ship is moving, the Channel is ahead, the Goodwins are to the southeast, and John Rivers is at the bow, thinking thoughts that are taking him somewhere very far from where he's supposed to be going. Before we follow the Lady Lovibond further along her course, let the story pause here for a moment, the way a long river pauses in a wide place and slows and spreads before it narrows again and quickens. Let the ship sail on without us for just a little while, moving south through the grey afternoon, and let us turn our attention to the Goodwin Sands, which are not incidental to this story, but are in some ways the true centre of it, the thing around which everything else orbits. The Goodwins lie roughly 4 miles east of the Kent coast, in the southern part of the North Sea where it begins to funnel down into the Strait of Dover. At low tide, parts of the sands break the surface, brown and flat and deceptively solid looking, catching the low winter sun in a way that could almost be mistaken for land if you did not know what you were looking at. At high tide they disappear completely beneath the surface, invisible and unannounced, exactly as deep as the hull of a vessel drawing sufficient draught and not 1 inch deeper. The sand itself is the particular sand of tidal banks, fine and wet and dense, with a quality that engineers and sailors who have studied it find difficult to describe precisely. It behaves in certain conditions like liquid, accepting things that fall into it and drawing them down without drama, without resistance, simply incorporating them into itself the way a body of water incorporates a stone. Ships that run aground on the Goodwins in the wrong conditions do not bounce off and float free. They settle, they sink slowly into the sand, and the sand comes up around them, and the tides shift the sand, and within months or years or sometimes decades, there is no evidence that the ship was ever there. The name Goodwin has been traced by those who find such things worth tracing to a thane named Godwin, Earl of Kent, who was said in the medieval period to have owned the land that once existed where the sands are now. The legend holds that the land was protected by a great seawall, and that the seawall fell into disrepair after Earl Godwin's death, and that the sea reclaimed the land so completely that no trace of it remained above the water. This story is almost certainly not true in its particulars. The geological evidence suggests that the Goodwins were always sand, never land, never farmed or inhabited. But the legend of the drowned estate, of the land that was lost to the sea through some combination of neglect and divine displeasure, has been attached to this place for so long that it has become its own kind of truth. What is certainly true is the accounting of the ships. The records that survive, which are incomplete and probably represent only a fraction of the actual total, suggest that more than 2,000 vessels have been lost to the Goodwin Sands. 2,000 is a number that sits in the mind without quite making itself felt, the way very large numbers do, abstractly, weightlessly. But think of it this way: 2,000 ships means tens of thousands of men, in water that would kill them within minutes in winter, in water that would take them down through the sand and keep them, in water that lies 4 miles from land they could see on a clear day and never reach. The wrecks are still there. That is the thing about the Goodwins that those who have studied them find most affecting. The sand preserves what it swallows. The cold and the anaerobic conditions deep in the sandbank prevent the usual deterioration of organic material, so that ships which went down in the 17th and 18th centuries have been found by divers and by archaeologists in the 20th, with their timbers still intact, with their cargo still in the holds, with artifacts still in the positions they occupied when the ship went down. The Goodwins are an enormous accidental archive, a library of lost ships written in wood and iron and bone. Maritime historians have documented at least 3 major periods of catastrophic loss on the Goodwins. There was the Great Storm of 1703, which the diarist and journalist Daniel Defoe described in such detail that his account is still the primary source for understanding what happened. In that single storm, over 40 ships were wrecked on the Goodwins. 13 men of war of the Royal Navy were lost in the wider channel. The toll in lives was in the thousands. Defoe walked the beaches of Kent afterward and saw the bodies and the wreckage and the debris that the sea had returned, after keeping what it wanted, and he wrote about it with the particular plainness of a man who understood that some things do not benefit from embellishment. Then there was the winter of 1748, the winter of our story, which was a winter of unusual severity and unusual storm activity across the southern North Sea. The winter of 1748 was remembered for years afterward by those who sailed these waters as a season of particular malevolence, a season when the Channel seemed determined to claim as many ships as it could before spring made things easier. The Goodwins were active that winter, in the sense that sandbanks can be said to be active, which is the sense of being exactly where they always are at exactly the depth they always are, while ships continue to make the mistake of forgetting this. Lightships had been moored near the Goodwins since the early 18th century, riding at anchor in water deep enough to be safe, their lanterns burning through the night to warn approaching ships of the danger nearby. These were not pleasant assignments. The men who crewed the lightships lived aboard them for months at a time, in conditions that made ordinary sea voyages seem comfortable by comparison. They could not leave when the weather worsened. They stayed at their stations through storms that would have driven any sensible ship for shelter, because the whole point of a lightship was that it was there precisely when other ships needed it most, which was when conditions were worst. The lightship nearest the Lady Lovibond's course on the first day of February, 1748, was the one stationed at the south end of the Goodwins, the most dangerous end, the end where the bank narrowed to a point and where the tidal currents ran in the particular sideways way that could push an inattentive vessel onto the sand before the helmsman had time to realize what was happening. The lightship was doing its job. Its lantern was burning. The danger was marked. But there are dangers that are marked and avoided, and there are dangers that are marked and not avoided, and the difference between them is not always a matter of the marking. Sometimes the difference is aboard the ship. Sometimes the difference is standing at the helm with its hands on the wheel and its mind somewhere else entirely, somewhere it should not be, somewhere it has no business being on a dark February night with the Goodwins 4 miles to starboard. Consider now, in the slow and comfortable place where you're settling, the patience of the sands. They have been there for thousands of years. They will be there for thousands more. The ships come and go, and sometimes the ships do not go at all, and the sands accept them with the same equanimity that they accept the tides, the same unhurried absorption that is the characteristic of very large, very old, very patient things. The Goodwins do not wait for anything, they simply are, and what comes to them, comes. There is a particular quality to the water over the Goodwins at night, which those who sail these waters and know what they are looking at have described in similar terms across 3 centuries of record-keeping. The water there is slightly luminous, they say, in the way that shallow water over pale sand is sometimes luminous, catching the starlight or the moonlight, and returning it in a diffuse glow that is not quite light and not quite darkness. On a clear night, if you know where to look, you can see the suggestion of the sands beneath the surface, a paler shadow in the dark water, a dimly backlit shape that lies there like something sleeping. Some of the older pilots who knew these waters said that you could smell the Goodwins before you saw them, that there was a particular smell to the water over the bank, a shallower smell than the deep sea smell, something with more sand in it, more estuary, more of the river-mouth character that the North Sea retained this close to shore. Whether this is true or whether it is the kind of thing that sailors say because the sea demands mythology, and the Goodwins in particular demand a more elaborate mythology than most, it is impossible at this distance to determine with certainty. What is possible to determine is that the Lady Lovibond knew these waters, or at least her captain did, or at least her captain had sailed them enough times to know where the sands were and how to avoid them, and what the prudent course looked like on a winter night with the wind from the northeast and the tide beginning its evening run. Captain Reed was not a reckless man. He was not an ignorant man. He knew these waters. He knew the Goodwins. He knew that you kept them to the east and stayed west and watched the lightship and did the things that experienced sailors do on a dark night in the Channel. But Captain Reed was below decks that night. Captain Reed was at dinner with his new wife and the wedding guests, in the warmth of the cabin, in the warmth of the occasion, in the warmth of a happiness that was, at that particular moment, total and unaware of its own fragility. The warmth of his new marriage was so complete in those early hours of the voyage that it filled him like light fills a room, leaving no corners for concern or caution. He was, for those hours, as safe and as happy as a man can be. And at the helm of the Lady Lovibond in the cold dark of the February night was John Rivers. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. There is more story ahead, more water to cross, more of the night to move through, and it will all be here when you return. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you wake. Sleep well. There are feelings that announce themselves when they arrive, that come in through the front door with noise and colour and a full awareness of their own presence. Grief often does this. Anger often does this. Even love sometimes arrives with a kind of fanfare that removes all ambiguity about what is happening and what it means. And then there are feelings that arrive differently, that come in through a side door in the small hours of some ordinary morning and are already settled at the table by the time you notice them, as if they have been there longer than you knew, as if they were there before you thought to look. John Rivers would not have been able to say, with any precision, when he had first understood that he loved the woman who was now Mrs. Reed. He knew it had been before the captain had met her, and he knew it had been long enough that it had become a quiet thing, a domestic thing, the way long-kept pain becomes domestic. It was the background of his days. It was the furniture of a room he lived in without examining. He had told no one. He had done nothing. He had simply carried it, the way a man carries a stone in his pocket, feeling the weight of it constantly without ever quite deciding what to do about it. He had met her through the captain. This was the particular cruelty of the situation. He had met her at the house of a mutual friend some 18 months before the wedding, when the captain had invited him to a supper, and she had been there with her family, and they had spoken for perhaps 20 minutes about nothing of consequence, about the weather and about a concert that was happening in the town that week, and about a book that someone at the table had read. And in those 20 minutes something had settled in him that had not been there before. He had said nothing. This was the first and most important decision, and it was made not as a decision but as a default, as the path of least action, which is the path most often taken by people who do not trust themselves to take any other path without making everything worse. He had said nothing because the captain was his employer and his friend, in the particular friendship that forms between officers who have spent time at sea together, the friendship of shared danger and shared competence, and the mutual respect of men who know what the other is capable of in the worst conditions. He had said nothing because he was the first mate, and she was a woman of good family, and the gap between those two positions was not easily crossed. He had said nothing because he did not know, with any certainty, what she felt, and asking would require saying something, and saying something would change everything, and he was afraid that what it would change everything into would be worse than what it already was. And then Captain Reed had noticed her, and then Captain Reed had courted her, and Rivers had watched this happen with a steadiness that he had been proud of, in a private and cheerless way, the steadiness of a man who has decided that endurance is the only virtue available to him. He had watched the courtship proceed through its stages with the patience of someone who has accepted that he is watching from outside a window at something warm that he will not be invited into. He had attended the dinners and the social occasions where the couple appeared together. He had said the correct things. He had behaved correctly. The captain had thanked him for his attendance and his manner, and his thanks had been genuine because the captain was a man of genuine feeling, which made the whole thing considerably more difficult. The wedding invitation had arrived on a Tuesday. Rivers had read it twice at his lodgings, sitting at the small table near the window that looked out over the harbour, and then he had put it down and sat with it for a while, not thinking, or rather thinking in the way that people think when the thinking is too much to shape into words, when it is only feeling, only the weight of what cannot be changed. He had attended. He had sat near the far end of the table. He had drunk his wine with steadiness. Now it was night, and he was at the helm of the Lady Lovibond, and below decks the captain was at dinner with his new wife and the wedding guests, and Rivers was alone with the wheel and the wind and the cold. The northeast wind was steady, and the ship was making good progress, and the night was clear enough to see stars above the clouds in the north. There was nothing wrong with the sailing. The sailing was going well. Everything about the sailing was exactly as it should be. What was not as it should be was what was happening inside him. He would not have described it to himself as malice, because he was not by nature a malicious man. He had spent 30 years being not a malicious man. He had been steady and reliable and capable and correct, and all of those qualities had served him well as a sailor and had served him poorly. He now understood, as a person with feelings, because they had trained him to contain things rather than express them, to manage rather than release, to absorb rather than respond. What was happening inside him that night, with the wheel in his hands and the good winds to the east and the cold coming in off the water, was not a plan. It was closer to a dissolution. It was the feeling that comes when something that has been held for a very long time is released all at once, not deliberately, not with intention, but because the container has finally exceeded its capacity and the contents can no longer be contained. It was the feeling that had been building since the wedding dinner and before, since the moment he had understood that the captain was going to marry her and that he, Rivers, was going to have to watch this and continue to function and continue to sail ships and continue to be the correct and capable person he had always been. He turned the wheel. It was not a large movement. It was the kind of movement that could have been an adjustment, a compensation for a wind shift, a small correction of course. It moved the Lady Lovibond perhaps 2 degrees to port, away from her intended southwesterly track, angling her slightly toward the east. 2 degrees does not sound like very much. Over a short distance, 2 degrees is almost nothing. Over the distance between where the Lady Lovibond was and the Goodwin Sands, 2 degrees was everything. Perhaps he did not know he was doing it. Perhaps the body does things that the mind has not yet admitted to intending, the way the body sometimes acts on what the mind refuses to acknowledge. Perhaps he knew perfectly well what he was doing and was doing it anyway, in the grip of something that was past the point of reason or consequence. Perhaps both of these things were true simultaneously, the way contradictory things can both be true in the hours of crisis, when the ordinary logic of cause and effect stops applying cleanly. The stars were very clear to the north. Below him, through the planking, he could hear the faint sounds of the cabin, music perhaps, or laughter, the muffled warmth of the celebration continuing in the shelter of the hull, while the cold took everything above the deck. The sails were full, the ship was moving well. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing would have seemed wrong. To anyone watching from above, the small 2-degree deviation in the Lady Lovibond's course would have been visible but perhaps not yet alarming, because ships adjust their courses constantly in response to wind and current and tide. But the Goodwins do not care about intentions. The Goodwins do not care about the feelings of the man at the helm, or the happiness of the wedding party below, or the 30 years of steady, correct behaviour that had brought John Rivers to this particular moment. The Goodwins are patient in the way that geography is patient, which is the patience of something that has no stake in the outcome, something that simply is, something that will still be there long after every person who ever sailed past it has dissolved into whatever comes after being a person. The course change was 2 degrees. The Goodwins were to the east. The night was clear, the lightship was burning, and the Lady Lovibond was moving slowly and steadily in a direction that would bring her, before the night was very much older, to the place where the pale sand waited under the dark water. There is nothing more to understand about this moment than what is already there. The understanding settles like the cold settles, gradually into the bones. You can feel it now in the warmth of where you are, the remoteness of it, the great distance of the February Channel, and the dark ship moving over the darker water. There is nothing you need to do with this feeling except let it be there. Let it be part of the story. Let the story move on as stories always move on, slowly and without hurry, the way water moves over sand. The accounts of what happened next vary in their particulars in the way that accounts of maritime disasters always vary, because the people best placed to describe exactly what occurred are usually the people who did not survive to describe it. What we know, assembled from the records of the time and the testimony of those on nearby vessels and the physical evidence of the sands themselves, is a sequence of events that has its own terrible clarity once you understand the geography and the conditions. The Lady Lovibond struck the Goodwin Sands at approximately 11 o'clock in the evening of February the 1st, 1748. The time is approximate because no one on the ship survived to confirm it, and because the clocks available to the crews of nearby vessels were not precise instruments. 11 o'clock is a consensus, drawn from several accounts of people who saw something from a distance, and noted approximately when they saw it. What they saw varied depending on where they were and how far away. Some reported a lantern light moving where no ship's lantern should be, too close to the sands, at an angle that made no navigational sense. Some reported hearing sounds, though the February night was not still, the wind was up and the sea was not quiet, and sounds carry strangely over water in ways that make it difficult to be certain of their source or their distance. At least one vessel, a collier making her way north along the Kent coast, reported seeing a ship in distress on or near the Goodwins and adjusting her course to investigate, only to find, when she reached the area, that there was nothing there but the dark water and the sand. There is a particular quality to the way a ship grounds on the Goodwin Sands that those who have experienced it and survived it describe in consistent terms. It is not, they say, a violent impact. It is not the sudden catastrophic collision that you might imagine when you hear the word shipwreck, the dramatic meeting of solid hull and solid rock that produces a crash and a fracture and an immediate flooding. The Goodwins are sand, sand yields. What happens when a ship grounds on the sands is more like a hand settling into wet clay than a cup breaking on a stone floor. The hull touches the sand accepts the hull, the ship slows, gradually, as if losing energy rather than meeting resistance, and then it stops. And then the real danger begins. Because the sand, having accepted the ship, does not release it. The weight of the vessel drives it deeper into the bank. The tides, which run hard and sideways over the Goodwins, push at the hull from unexpected directions. The ship begins to shift and to settle, not evenly but unevenly, as different parts of the hull encounter different depths of sand. The masts lean, the rigging falls slack and then taut and then slack again as the ship tilts, and the waves, which over shallow water become shorter and steeper, and more forceful than they are in deep water, begin to break against and over the hull, with a persistence that wood and iron can withstand for a while, but not forever. When the Lady Lovibond struck the sands, the people below decks would have felt it in a way that was confusing before it was frightening. The cessation of forward motion, after hours of steady sailing, would have been the first sign, and it would have felt more like an unexplained pause than a disaster, more like an interruption than an ending. Then the ship's behaviour would have changed, the familiar motion of a vessel under sail replaced by the unfamiliar motion of a vessel at the mercy of something other than the wind, something that was pushing from below and from the sides in ways that had no pattern. Captain Reed would have come to the deck immediately. He was a sailor. His body would have known before his mind completed the assessment that something was wrong. The feel of a ship aground is unmistakable to someone who has spent their life at sea, the same way a musician hears a wrong note before they have consciously identified which note it is or why it is wrong. He would have come through the hatch and into the cold and the wind, and he would have seen, in the moment before he looked at anything else, where the helmsman was and what he had done. What River's expression was in that moment is beyond anyone's knowing. Whether there was remorse or defiance or the blank vacancy of a man who has done something that he himself does not quite understand yet, the record does not say. The record does not have rivers in it at all after the ship left Gravesend. He is present only in the telling, in the shape of the story, in the place where he should be standing, and the absence of any account of what he said or did after the wheel was turned. The wedding guests below decks did not know what was happening until it was apparent. The ship's sudden stillness after hours of motion would have seemed strange, not alarming. The sounds that followed, the grinding of hull against sand, the changed quality of the movement, the altered sound of the rigging, these would have taken time to interpret. By the time the full understanding arrived, the ship would already be settling. By the time the full understanding arrived, the cold water of the February Channel would already be finding the gaps and the seams and the places where the hull had been deformed by the impact with the sand. February water in the North Sea is 9 or 10 degrees Celsius, which is cold enough to incapacitate the body within minutes and to kill within 30. The survivors of cold water immersion describe the experience with a consistency that makes it clear that the body's response to that temperature is immediate and total, a kind of physiological overriding of anything the mind might prefer to do, a commandeering of every resource for the single purpose of generating heat, a purpose that the body pursues with desperation and ultimately fails. There were no survivors from the Lady Lovibond. This is stated in the accounts of the time with the flatness of fact rather than the weight of tragedy, because the records of maritime casualties in 1748 were not written with the intention of preserving the emotional weight of individual deaths. They were administrative documents, lists and tallies and accountings, the bureaucratic processing of disaster into data, all hands lost, vessel a total loss, date, February 1st, 1748, cause, grounding on the Goodwin Sands, position, approximate. All hands. This is a phrase that contains everything and nothing simultaneously. It contains the captain and his new wife and her sisters and their husbands and the family friends who had been promised a pleasant sea voyage and the minimum crew necessary to sail the vessel. It contains people who had names and addresses and family members who received news of what had happened in the days following, who were told in the language of the time that the vessel had been lost with all hands and that their person would not be returning from the voyage. It contains John Rivers, who had turned the wheel. Whether Rivers understood, in the minutes between the grounding and the end, what he had done and what it had cost, is the kind of question that this story cannot answer and does not try to answer. There is no witness. There is only the shape of the event, the fact of what happened and the fact of who was at the helm when it happened. And between those two facts lies everything that the imagination tends to fill in and everything that the historical record declines to specify. The Goodwins kept them, as the Goodwins keep what they receive. The sand closed over the Lady Lovibond as it had closed over hundreds of ships before her and would close over hundreds more. The cold water of the channel moved over the place where she had been and left no sign. By morning the tide had shifted the sand and covered the wreck, and the Goodwins looked as they always look in the early light, flat and pale and patient, revealing nothing of what lies beneath. The lightship had been burning all night. The light had been there, the warning had been visible, and somewhere under the sand of the Goodwins, in the cold that does not change and the dark that is complete, the Lady Lovibond settled into what would become her permanent position, 4 miles off the Kent coast in the ship Swallower, in the place where time continues without quite moving forward in the ordinary way. Rest with that for a moment. Let the story have its pause here, the way night has its deepest pause just before the first suggestion of morning arrives. The ship is down, the sands are quiet, and something has ended that was, by every ordinary measure, over. And yet the story is not over, because the story has not reached its strangest chapter yet. The story has not yet reached 1798. 50 years is a long time in a human life. In 1798, there were very few people alive in England who had been alive in 1748, and those who had been alive in 1748 were old enough that their memories of that year were the attenuated, sepia memories of early childhood, impressions more than events, feelings more than facts. The world had changed considerably in those 50 years. There had been the American Revolution, which had removed a significant portion of the British Empire from the map and created a country where before there had been colonies. There had been the French Revolution, which had removed the French monarchy from existence, and created a state of affairs so complicated and dangerous that Britain found itself in the early stages of what would become more than 20 years of war. The Channel, in 1798, was a military object as much as a commercial one, crowded with warships and dispatch vessels and privateers, in addition to the ordinary traffic of merchantmen and fishing boats. In this changed world, in the month of February 1798, exactly 50 years after the Lady Lovibond had gone down on the Goodwin Sands, something was seen near the sands that caused some considerable discussion among the people who saw it. The accounts from 1798 are more fragmented than we might like. The year falls in a period of considerable archival difficulty, the records of the period being distributed across various collections and not always well preserved. But the core of what is reported is consistent enough across the sources that exist to give it a shape. Multiple witnesses, in the vicinity of the Goodwin Sands in the early days of February 1798, reported seeing a three-masted schooner sailing a course that would take her directly onto the sands. The witnesses differed on details. They differed on exactly when they saw the vessel, and on what the weather conditions were, and on precisely where they were positioned when they made the sighting. What they did not differ on was the essential observation: a ship behaving in a way that no ship should behave near the Goodwins in those conditions, appearing to sail into the sands rather than around them, and then not being there when they looked again or when other vessels went to investigate. One account that has been cited more often than others is attributed to a Captain Westover, though the primary document in which this attribution appears is itself of uncertain provenance, which means that we have a citation of a memory, which is a degree of removal from original testimony that should make any careful reader cautious. Nevertheless, the Westover account describes a vessel sighted from his ship, a vessel whose lanterns burned with an unusual yellowish light, whose sails appeared to be set for a course that made no navigational sense, and which disappeared when his crew attempted to approach it to offer assistance. His attempt to approach is described as frustrated by the behaviour of his own vessel, which responded sluggishly to the helm, in conditions where she should have responded well, as if the water itself were thicker near the sighting. A second account, more solidly attested in terms of its chain of transmission, describes a group of fishermen out of Deal who were working the edges of the sands in the way that local fishing boats had worked them for generations, those edges of the bank where the feeding was good for the fish that fed on the small things that lived in the sand. The fishermen reported seeing a ship they did not recognise, moving at speed across the face of the sands in a direction that would have taken her onto them within minutes. They watched, expecting to see the ship ground and stop, preparing themselves to respond in the way that Kent fishermen always prepared to respond to vessels in distress near the Goodwins, because being close enough to help when a ship went onto the sands was one of the opportunities for profit and salvage that living near the Goodwins provided. But the ship did not ground. The ship continued moving, and then the ship was not there. The fishermen, according to the account, were disturbed by this. The word disturbed is used in the source text, and it is a careful word, a word that is placed there deliberately to indicate something specific, not frightened, not confused, but disturbed in the sense of having had something shift inside them that they found difficult to articulate afterward. They had seen a ship. The ship had been real, or had appeared real, in the same way that everything visible is real, in that it was there and then it was not there. What made it disturbing rather than simply puzzling was the recognition, which came to them slowly as they discussed it among themselves on the return journey to Deal, that the course the ship had been sailing, and the lanterns it had been carrying, and the three masts and the general aspect of the vessel was consistent with descriptions they had heard, in the way that coastal communities absorb the stories of their waters over generations of the Lady Lovibond. Whether this recognition was the product of genuine similarity, or of the human tendency to make the unfamiliar familiar by attaching it to a known story, is impossible to determine. What is possible to determine is that the story of the 1798 sighting circulated in the coastal communities of Kent for some years afterward, and that in circulating it accumulated a specific quality, the quality of the 50-year interval. People noted that the sighting had occurred 50 years after the sinking. They noted that the ship had appeared, according to the available accounts, near the date of the anniversary, and in noting these things, they arrived at the proposition that would define the Lady Lovibond legend for everything that followed, the proposition that she returns every 50 years, that she will return again. This is the nature of certain stories. that they acquire a structure as they pass from person to person, a logic that feels inevitable once it is established, that seems to have been there from the beginning even though it was added in the telling. The 50-year interval was not, in the original accounts of the 1748 disaster, presented as anything other than the period between the sinking and the first sighting. But once the interval was noted, and once the 1798 sighting was interpreted as a return rather than a coincidence, the 50-year rule became part of the legend's architecture, as fundamental to the structure as the jealous first mate and the doomed wedding voyage. What is particularly interesting about the 50-year interval, if you're inclined to find such things interesting, which you may or may not be as you settle deeper into the comfortable place where stories are received rather than analysed, is that it is long enough to exceed a single human memory. Most people who were adults in 1748 would not have been alive in 1798. The story of the 1748 wreck would have been something those people heard as children, half absorbed, attached to the half-dreamlike authority of childhood knowledge, the things you knew before you were old enough to question how you knew them. And so the 1798 sighting would have been received not as the repeat of something remembered directly, but as the fulfillment of something half-known, the arrival of something that had been expected in the vague, low-urgency way that legendary events are always expected, without great conviction but without quite being disbelieved either. The Kent coast in February is a specific kind of cold, a cold that comes off the North Sea without obstruction, carrying with it all the distances it has crossed from the continental coast and beyond. It is a flat cold, without the drama of mountain cold or the sharpness of frost, but with a persistence that gets into everything, into the stone of the buildings and the wood of the fishing boats and the blankets on the beds of the fishermen's houses. It is the kind of cold that makes the interior warmth of a house feel like something earned rather than something taken for granted, and it gives to the stories told in those warm interiors a quality of contrast, a quality of the dark outside against the light inside that is particularly receptive to ghost stories. The Lady Lovibond was becoming a ghost story. It had begun as a maritime disaster, a specific and tragic event with specific and traceable causes, the kind of thing that ended up in the records of the Board of Trade and was cited in subsequent inquiries as an example of the dangers of the Goodwin Sands and the importance of maintaining the lightships in good working order. But by 1798, 50 years on, it was acquiring the quality of legend, the quality of a story that is larger than its original facts, that has been shaped by telling into something more than what happened, into something that speaks to what always happens, to the permanent things rather than the specific ones. The permanent things in this story are not the ship or the captain or the jealous first mate. The permanent things are the feelings, the love that was not declared and then could not be declared, the love that was declared and accepted and celebrated and then taken away, the violence that comes when feeling has been compressed beyond the point where it can be contained, and the guilt that is so large and so permanent that it cannot be resolved, that persists beyond the death of the person who carries it, that continues in some form that is difficult to name but not impossible to feel. Ghost stories are almost always about unresolved feelings. The dead who haunt are almost always the dead who could not finish something, who were taken in the middle of something that left a loose end in the world, a thread that was not tied off and that continues to pull. The Lady Lovibond, in the shape it took as legend, is about a love and a betrayal and a destruction that no 50 years of ocean could resolve, that no accumulation of salt water and cold darkness could bring to a conclusion. The ship keeps sailing the same course because the feeling that drove her onto the sands is still there, still pressing, still unfinished. Or that is one way of thinking about it, the way you might think about it in the half-drowsy place between the story and sleep, where the rational mind is not quite in charge, and the older, stranger mind is allowed to have its say about what things mean. You do not have to think about it at all. You can simply let the image be there. The pale ship moving across the dark water near the sands, the yellow lanterns burning in the February night, the sails full and the course set and the ship moving towards something that it has been moving toward for 250 years and more. The fishing boats from Deal that had watched the 1798 apparition returned to their harbour in the particular silence of men who had seen something they could not explain and who knew that the explaining would take longer than the seeing. Their wives met them at the waterfront as the wives of Deal fishermen had always met them, with the practical attention of women who needed to know whether the catch was good and whether everything was intact, and then with the less practical attention of women who could read in the faces of their men that something had happened that was not about fish. "What did you see?" they asked, and the fishermen told them, and the women listened, and they knew the Lady Lovibond story because everyone on the Kent coast knew the Lady Lovibond story, and they put it together in the way that the people of the coast had always put these things together, which was with a seriousness and a calm that the story deserved, without dismissal and without drama. The telling that night, in the houses of Deal with the cold coming off the sea and the lanterns burning against it, was the beginning of the 1798 account's entry into the legend. The stories went out from those houses into the wider community of the coast, and from the coast into the print culture of the period, in the fragmentary and imprecise way that pre-telegraph communication worked, losing specificity as they travelled, but gaining the weight of repeated telling, gaining the authority of something that had been said by multiple people in multiple places and had survived the process of multiple tellings with its essential shape intact. The year 1848 was one of the most turbulent years in European history, a fact that has nothing to do with the Lady Lovibond except in the way that very large events provide a kind of context for very small ones, the way a storm makes the sound of a single raindrop against a window more noticeable by comparison. In 1848, revolutions were happening across the continent, kings were fleeing their capitals, and the whole structure of the European political life was in convulsion. In England, the year was watched with a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. Satisfaction because England had not yet convulsed in the same way, anxiety because it might yet do so. In Kent, in February of 1848, away from the revolutionary ferment of the continent, and in the particular quietness of a coastal county that had its own concerns and its own rhythms, the question of whether the Lady Lovibond would appear again was apparently being discussed among those who knew the legend. The 50-year interval had been established after 1798. The 50 years were up in 1848. The anniversary was February the 1st, and in the days and weeks surrounding that date, there was apparently some anticipation among the fishing and maritime communities of the Kent coast that something might be seen near the Goodwins. Whether this anticipation itself shaped what was subsequently reported is one of the questions that hangs over the 1848 accounts, as it hangs over all the accounts in the Lady Lovibond story. The problem of expectation and perception is a genuine one. If a community has been told for 50 years that a ghost ship will appear near a certain location on a certain approximate date, and people in that community go to that location around that date and look for the ghost ship, the probability of someone reporting that they saw something increases substantially, because the expectation is already there, the template is already in the mind, and any ambiguous visual stimulus in the right location at the right time will be interpreted through that template. This is not to say that the 1848 sightings were fabricated or deliberate inventions. Most people who report unusual sightings in maritime environments are describing something they genuinely believe they saw. The question is not whether they believe it, but what they were actually perceiving, and in conditions of poor visibility, unusual atmospheric conditions, the natural optical effects that occur over shallow water, and the heightened attentiveness of a person who is specifically looking for something, there are many phenomena that could produce an impression consistent with a three-masted vessel moving in an unusual way. The 1848 accounts are better documented than the 1798 ones, partly because the century had brought improvements in record-keeping and in the literacy of the populations from whom the witnesses came, and partly because by 1848 the legend of the Lady Lovibond had acquired enough status in the local culture that people who saw something they believed to be the ghost ship were more likely to write it down, or to report it in a way that entered the record. The Victorian period was, in general, more interested in the documentation of unusual phenomena than previous centuries had been. It had a particular relationship with the supernatural that was more systematic and more curious than the relationship of earlier periods, partly because the rational and scientific worldview was becoming increasingly dominant, and the supernatural was becoming increasingly something that needed to be either explained or deliberately preserved against explanation. Several accounts from February 1848 describe a vessel seen near the Goodwins in conditions of poor visibility, misty weather with intermittent fog, that made the observation of distant objects uncertain. One account from a sailor aboard a coastal vessel making her way along the Kent shore in the days around the 1st of February describes seeing lights on the sands in a position and configuration that appear to correspond to the running lights of a three-masted sailing vessel. He described the lights as yellow, an unusual colour for maritime lanterns of the period, which were typically white or occasionally red or green for the port and starboard signals. Yellow lights, he said, moving at a speed consistent with a sailing vessel in moderate wind on a course that should have taken the vessel directly onto the sands. His account was recorded in the log of his vessel, which is the most reliable form of maritime record because log entries are made contemporaneously rather than from memory, without the distortions that time introduces into recalled testimony. The entry notes the sighting, notes the bearing and approximate distance, notes the unusual colour of the lights, and notes that when the vessel altered course to investigate, nothing was found in the area. The log entry does not mention the Lady Lovibond by name, which is either evidence that the sailor did not know the legend, or that he considered it too obvious to mention, or that he was simply recording the facts of his observation, without the interpretive layer that would be added later by others. There is something profoundly Victorian about the way the Lady Lovibond legend was received and amplified in this period. The Victorians had a complicated relationship with death and the afterlife that manifested in their culture in ways that seemed strange to modern eyes. The elaborate mourning rituals, the preservation of locks of hair and other intimate relics of the dead, the popularity of ghost stories and supernatural fiction, the serious scientific investigations into paranormal phenomena conducted by organizations like the Society for Psychical Research. All of these were expressions of the same underlying anxiety, the anxiety produced by a culture that was increasingly committed to scientific rationalism, but that had not yet figured out what to do with death, with the gap between the living and the dead, with the apparent finality of loss. A ship crewed by the dead, returning every 50 years to sail the course of her last voyage, fit perfectly into this cultural context. It was precisely the kind of story that the Victorian sensibility found compelling, a story that had the form of a scientific puzzle, a phenomenon that recurred at regular intervals and could therefore be predicted and observed, but that resisted scientific explanation, that remained stubbornly in the category of the uncanny, despite the best efforts of rational analysis. The Lady Lovibond was a Victorian ghost story before the Victorians got to her, but the Victorians were very ready to receive her and to add their own particular quality of yearning for something beyond the purely material world. The Kent coast in this period was a well-documented landscape, the subject of watercolour paintings and written descriptions and early photography, the object of the tourist attention that the railways were beginning to make possible. Deal and Ramsgate and Broadstairs and the other towns of the coast were being discovered or rediscovered by middle-class Victorians looking for sea air and picturesque scenery, and the particular quality of light that comes off the channel in certain seasons. And with the tourist came an appetite for local colour, for stories, for the things that made a place specific rather than generic, and the legend of the Lady Lovibond was precisely the kind of local colour that made the Kent coast specific, that gave it a depth of story that made the sea views more than merely pretty. Local publications began to write about the Lady Lovibond in this period with more specificity than earlier accounts had achieved. The story was told in newspapers and in the small guides to coastal walks and sea views that were being produced for the tourist trade. It was told in the way that local legends are told when they are being made available to outsiders, which is with a mixture of the genuine and the theatrical, with a careful calibration of enough skepticism to reassure the educated reader that the teller is not credulous, and enough atmospheric detail to make the story worth telling. The legend was being packaged, in the gentle way that all legends eventually get packaged, for the consumption of people who did not grow up with it. What was not lost in this packaging was the essential quality of the story, the quality that made it grip and continue to grip across the changes of the century. The Lady Lovibond was not simply a ghost ship. She was a ship whose haunting was caused by a specific comprehensible human situation: jealousy, betrayal, the destruction of what should have been a beginning. This gave the story an emotional coherence that purely supernatural tales often lack, a reason for the haunting that connected it to ordinary human experience rather than to the abstract machinery of the paranormal. People understood what had happened. They understood why it might not have ended. They understood in the particular way that grief and guilt and love are understood, that some things do not simply stop when the body stops. Somewhere in the Goodwin Sands, 50 feet under the grey February water, the timber of the Lady Lovibond was still there, preserved by the cold and the sand. the ship that had been the wedding vessel of Captain Reed and his new bride, that had been turned onto the sands by the man at the helm who could not bear what was happening below decks, was still there in the sand, waiting. And every 50 years, if the legend was to be believed, something of her came back up through the water and sailed the course she had sailed in 1748, sailed it again in the cold and the dark, sailed it all the way to the same ending, and then was gone until the next 50 years had passed. There is a quality of exhaustion in this image, or there can be, if you turn it a certain way in the light. The eternal repetition of the same course, the same voyage, the same approach to the same sands, with no possibility of a different outcome, no possibility of turning away, no possibility of arriving somewhere other than where she always arrives. It is the quality of a dream in which the same thing happens over and over, in which no amount of trying produces a different result, in which the ending is always the same regardless of what you do between the beginning and the end. Let that quality settle into the place where you are resting. Let the image of the ship on its endless course be a gentle one, the way the endlessness of the sea is gentle, the way the tides are gentle, the way all the large repeating patterns of the natural world are gentle when you are warm and safe and watching from a distance. The ship is out there on the water, the Goodwins are patient, and you are here, in the warmth, in the story, which is a safe place to be. The town of Deal stands on the Kent coast 4 miles west of the Goodwin Sands, which means that Deal has been watching the sands for as long as Deal has been a town, and Deal has been a town for a very long time. The Romans knew this coast, the Saxons knew this coast. The Normans who arrived in 1066 recognised immediately the strategic importance of the narrow water between Deal and the French coast at Calais, where the channel was at its narrowest, where the passage between the North Sea and the Atlantic was tight enough that any serious naval power on this coast could influence what moved through it. But the character of Deal that concerns us is not its military character, which has been amply documented elsewhere, but its maritime character, the character of a town whose economy and identity were built around the sea, and specifically around the Goodwin Sands, because the sands, which were a danger to ships, were also, for the people who lived close enough to respond quickly to disasters on them, a source of income. The salvage of cargo and material from vessels that ran aground, the rescue of passengers and crew from ships in distress. These were activities that Deal men had practiced for centuries, that they had refined into something approaching a profession, and that they had equipped themselves for with the particular boats that became known across the maritime world as Deal beach boats or hovelers. The hoveler was a shallow-drafted, open-keeled boat designed specifically for the conditions of the Goodwins. It needed to be able to launch from a beach through surf because Deal had no harbour, only the open beach, and getting a boat into the water at Deal in a storm required the kind of boat that could be dragged across the sand and launched through breaking waves by a crew of men who were strong enough and coordinated enough to do this in conditions that would have defeated most boats and most crews. The hoveler was also fast, designed for the sprint across the 4 miles of water between the beach and the sands, in conditions where every minute mattered, where the difference between arriving while people were still alive and arriving when they were not was measured in the rate at which hypothermic water took its toll. The Deal boatmen were famous throughout the maritime world of the 18th and 19th centuries. They were known for their courage and their seamanship, and their willingness to put out in conditions that drove other boats back to harbour. They were also known, with somewhat more ambiguity, for their commercial acumen, for the speed with which they moved from rescue operations to salvage operations, and for the way in which the line between the two could become somewhat unclear in the heat of a maritime emergency. A ship on the sands was a commercial opportunity as well as a human tragedy, and the Deal men understood both dimensions of the situation simultaneously, with a practicality that their admirers found admirable and their critics found troubling. The stories that the Deal boatmen accumulated over the centuries of their work near the Goodwins were stories of extraordinary conditions and extraordinary deeds, stories that circulated in the town and in the maritime press, and in the records of the various organisations that recognised maritime heroism. There were boats that had gone out in hurricanes and returned with survivors. There were rescues of hundreds of people from single wrecks. There were also, inevitably, boats that had not come back, crews that had gone out in conditions that were beyond even the hoveler's ability to manage, men who had gone to help other men and had met the same fate. In this culture of intimate familiarity with maritime disaster, the Lady Lovibond occupied a specific position. She was part of the history of the sands, which was the history the Deal men lived inside, and she was also something more than ordinary history because of the 50-year interval, because of the persistence of the sightings, because of the quality the legend had acquired by the mid-19th century of being a fixture, a permanent feature of the Goodwins as real in its way as the sandbanks themselves. The Deal men's relationship with the Lady Lovibond legend was typically practical. They knew the story, they knew the dates, and in the years when the anniversary approached, particularly in February of 1848, and then in February of 1898, the boatmen were not unaware that people would be watching the sands more closely than usual, that the legend would be generating a quality of attention that it did not receive in the intervening years. Some of them, in later accounts, are reported to have watched the sands themselves around the anniversary dates, with the particular watchfulness of men who have spent their working lives reading water and light and weather for information about what ships are doing and what ships might need. What they reported in those accounts that survive varies considerably. Some Deal men in later interviews about the legend were dismissive of the story in the flat, practical way of men who have too much experience of the reality of maritime disaster to have much patience for its supernatural elaboration. The sands are dangerous, they would say in effect, and many ships have gone down on them, and it is not surprising that people see unusual things near them sometimes, because unusual things happen on the sea. This was not the same as denying that anything had been seen. It was the denial of the interpretation rather than the observation. Other accounts from Deal men were less dismissive. There are references in the later literature to boatmen who declined to go out near the sands around the anniversary dates, not from superstition exactly, but from a quality of reluctance that they found difficult to articulate beyond saying that the water near the sands felt different in those periods, felt wrong in a way that their experience did not give them a precise vocabulary to describe. The sea communicates to those who have spent their lives on it in ways that are partly rational, partly the product of pattern recognition built up over decades of experience, and partly something else, something that does not divide cleanly into rational or irrational. The Goodwins have their own ecology. This is a fact rather than a figure of speech. The tidal banks support communities of marine life that are different from those in the surrounding deeper water. Communities adapted to the particular conditions of shallow, frequently disturbed, nutrient-rich sand. The fish that feed on the small invertebrates in the sand attract the fish that feed on those fish, which attract the seabirds that dive for fish. The sands in the right season are extraordinarily productive, which is why the Deal fishermen work their edges despite the danger, because the fishing was too good to abandon simply because the conditions were difficult. The sands also have their own atmospheric character. The shallow water above them heats and cools differently from the deep water on either side, creating temperature gradients that produce fog in certain conditions, that refract light in certain conditions, that create the particular optical phenomenon known as a mirage, in conditions where the temperature differential between the water surface and the air immediately above it is sufficient. Mirages at sea are not the shimmering desert illusions of popular imagination. They are cooler and quieter than that, more subtle, the kind of thing that you might see for several minutes before you were certain that what you were seeing was not simply a distant ship that was in fact there. The optical properties of the air above the Goodwin Sands in February, with the cold water under the cold air and the particular geometry of the channel in that location, are exactly the conditions that produce refraction effects. The old maritime term for this phenomenon is looming, the appearance of objects that are below the horizon or beyond normal visual range, projected upward by the bending of light rays through layers of air of different temperatures. A looming could produce the appearance of a ship that was actually many miles away, or even of a ship that was no longer there, because light that has travelled a great distance through varying atmospheric conditions does not necessarily carry with it any reliable information about the current state of the object it originally reflected from. None of this disproves what the witnesses saw. It provides a possible mechanism, not a certainty. The witnesses were people of experience. The Deal boatmen knew what a looming looked like. The sailors who had logged the sightings in their ship's records had seen unusual atmospheric effects before and knew the difference, or believed they knew the difference, between a looming and a real vessel. Whether they were correct in their assessments is beyond determination at this distance. The accounts exist. The uncertainty exists. Both will persist together, the way the ship and the sands persist together, neither one cancelling the other. Here is something to carry with you, gently, as you drift. The Goodwin Sands have been there for thousands of years, and will be there long after every person currently alive has joined the accounting of the gone. The ships they have swallowed are beyond counting. The stories those ships carried are beyond recovery. And somewhere in that enormous archive of the lost, in the cold and the dark 4 miles off the Kent coast, the Lady Lovibond is keeping her particular place, waiting for whatever the 50-year mark brings, which is either the return of her light to the surface of the water, or the return of the attention of the living to the fact of her being there, under the sand still. To understand the Lady Lovibond properly, to hold her in the mind with the weight she deserves, it helps to understand the world she was part of, the world of English commercial sail in the middle of the 18th century, a world so distant from the present in its material conditions and its social arrangements and its relationship to the sea that it requires a certain imaginative effort to enter. Not an effort of sympathy, because the people who lived in that world were not so different from the people who live in this one, not in their capacity for love and jealousy and ambition and fear, but an effort of context, of furnishing the scene with the right objects and the right smells and the right qualities of light and labour. A ship like the Lady Lovibond, a three-masted schooner of moderate size engaged in the coastal and short-range international trade, was a working environment of a very specific and demanding kind. The crew would have been a small one by the standards of the larger ships of the period, perhaps 15 to 20 men depending on the voyage and the cargo, enough to handle the sails and the lines and the anchor and the daily maintenance that kept a wooden ship at sea from becoming a wooden ship that was no longer seaworthy. They would have slept in hammocks in the forecastle, the forward section of the ship below the main deck, in conditions that were cramped and damp and cold in February, and hot and airless in summer, conditions that the sailors who lived in them accepted without much comment because they were the conditions of the work and the work was what they knew. The food aboard a ship of this period was governed by the twin constraints of preservation and economics. Fresh food lasted only a few days at sea, longer in cold weather than in warm, and then the crew moved to the preserved stores: salt beef, salt pork, dried peas and beans, hard biscuit that was baked dry enough to resist mould for months, but that became progressively more inhabited by weevils as a voyage went on, with the pragmatic response being to tap the biscuit on the table before eating it to knock the weevils loose, or simply to eat in the dark so as not to see what was in the biscuit. This was not considered hardship in any formal sense. This was simply the diet of people who went to sea, and the people who went to sea ate it without the kind of complaint that people who had never been to sea might have made. Water was another constraint. Fresh water was stored in barrels in the hold, and it deteriorated over the course of a voyage in ways that the chemistry of the period could not explain and the sailors of the period could not prevent. The water became progressively less pleasant as the voyage continued, and the standard solution was to add a proportion of beer or spirits to it, which served both as a preservative in some sense and as a way of making the taste more acceptable. The ration of beer or spirits that a sailor received as part of his daily allowance was not primarily a luxury or a concession to human weakness. It was a practical response to the problem of keeping a crew healthy and hydrated in conditions where the water alone could not reliably be trusted. The officers of the Lady Lovibond lived in conditions somewhat better than those of the common sailors, but not enormously better. Captain Reed had his own cabin, which was the largest private space on the ship, located in the stern where the motion of the vessel in a seaway was least extreme, furnished with a bunk and a desk and some storage for his personal effects and his charts and his instruments. It was a private space, which was the real luxury, the ability to be alone in an environment where privacy was otherwise essentially unavailable. The first mate, John Rivers, would have had a smaller cabin off the main officer's quarters, a space just large enough for a bunk and a chest and the basic necessities of occupying space on a ship. The relationship between a captain and his first mate was a relationship of professional intimacy that had no precise analogy in shoreside life. They worked together constantly, shared responsibility for the safety of the vessel and the lives of the crew, communicated about the ship's condition and the weather and the navigation with the easy fluency of people who had learned to anticipate each other's thinking. They knew each other's professional habits and preferences and capabilities in the thorough way that colleagues who work in close quarters under pressure come to know each other. What they did not necessarily know was each other's inner life, the part of the person that existed beneath the professional surface, the part that had feelings about things that had nothing to do with the trim of the sails or the reading of the barometer. Rivers had sailed under Captain Reed for 3 years before the voyage of the Lady Lovibond, which is long enough to have developed the professional intimacy, but not necessarily long enough to have developed the personal transparency that would have made what Rivers was carrying visible to the captain. 3 years of watching someone do their job well is not the same as 3 years of knowing who they are when they are not doing their job. The sea creates a particular kind of relationship between the people who share it, a relationship built on the practical and the immediate, on what needs to be done and who can be relied upon to do it. And this relationship can coexist with a profound ignorance of the interior life of the person you are relying on. Captain Reed had relied on Rivers. He had trusted Rivers with the helm on nights when he needed rest. He had trusted Rivers with the management of the crew and the maintenance of the rigging, and the 1,000 daily tasks that kept a ship functioning. He had trusted Rivers in the way that captains trust first mates who have not given them reason to distrust them, with a trust that was based on professional performance rather than personal knowledge. And professional performance is not the same as character, and character is not the same as what a person will do under the pressure of the thing they have been carrying silently for months. The English commercial sea trade of 1748 was a world of contracts and custom, and the particular informal codes that governed life aboard ships, codes that had developed over centuries of maritime practice and that were understood by everyone in the trade whether or not they had ever been written down. There were things you did and things you did not do. You kept your watch, you did your work, you obeyed the captain's orders, you did not interfere with the navigation of the vessel for personal reasons. These were not laws exactly, though some of them had legal dimensions. They were the accumulated wisdom of the sea, the rules that kept wooden ships and their crews alive in an environment that was implacably indifferent to human survival. John Rivers knew all of these codes. He had grown up in them. He had spent his working life living by them. The fact that he turned the wheel anyway, that he set aside the codes of his profession and the safety of his colleagues and the lives of the wedding party below decks for the sake of something that was happening inside him that he could not contain, is the measure of how large the thing inside him had grown. You do not turn a ship onto the Goodwin Sands by accident. You do not do it carelessly or thoughtlessly or in a moment of simple inattention. You do it when something has grown large enough to overwhelm everything else, every professional instinct, every habit of care and competence, every consideration except the one that has taken up all the available space inside you. The sea forgives nothing. This is one of the truisms of maritime life, one of the things that sailors say because it is true, because the sea does not adjust its requirements based on the circumstances of the people who are on it, does not make exceptions for grief or rage or the particular extremity of a feeling that has been compressed past the point where it can be contained. The sea is what it is. The Goodwins are where they are, and the consequences of turning a wheel 2 degrees in the wrong direction are the same whether the person who turns it is doing so deliberately or carelessly, or under the influence of something they do not fully understand. The consequences came quickly, as consequences on the sea always come quickly, with the particular speed of physical reality asserting itself against the human arrangements that have temporarily defied it. The ship was on the sand. The sea was in the ship. The February water was doing what February water does, which is to take the warmth from everything it touches with an efficiency that is almost mechanical, almost indifferent to the fact that what it is taking warmth from is a living person with feelings and a history, and a future that has now been foreclosed. The foreclosure happened in the cold and the dark and the confusion of a ship in distress, on a winter night 4 miles from a coast that was visible by day and invisible by night, on a night when there was no moon, and the stars were insufficient to light the way to shore, and the shore was too far for anyone to swim to, and the Goodwins were doing what the Goodwins do, which is to hold what they have been given, and to keep it in the cold and the dark, in the patient and total way of things that have been doing what they do for thousands of years without interruption. This is what happened in 1748, reduced to its material facts. A ship turned onto the sand, the sea came in. The cold took the warmth. No one reached the coast. The Goodwins kept them. These are the facts. The story that grew up around the facts is something else, something larger and more durable than the facts, something that has survived 270 years while the facts have remained in the archives and under the sand. The story is what the facts became when they were passed from person to person, when they were shaped by the needs of the people who told them and the people who heard them, when they became not just what happened but what it means, which is the only question that keeps any story alive. There is a particular quality to the night before a wedding, a quality that people who have been through it often describe in similar terms: the sense of standing at a threshold, of being in a space between two different versions of your life, the version that came before and the version that begins the next day. It is a time of unusual clarity and unusual anxiety, a time when the weight of what is about to change makes everything in the present moment feel very specific and very vivid, the way things feel when you know they are about to be different. The woman who would become Mrs. Reed on the night before her wedding was somewhere on that threshold. She was in her family's house, or in the rooms at the inn where the wedding was being held, in the particular warmth of the celebration's eve, surrounded by the people who mattered to her, who had known her in the version of herself that was about to change. Her sisters were with her, probably, her mother, if her mother was living, the friends who'd been invited to the ceremony and who would see the next morning's event as the event it officially was, which was a happy one, an occasion for congratulation and good wishes, and the conventional expressions of hope for a future that everyone present wanted to believe would be good. What she thought about that night, what she felt, is not recorded anywhere in any form that has survived. The Lady Lovibond legend does not give her an interior life. The historical record does not give her a name that has been consistently preserved. She exists in the story as a function, as the beloved whose existence sets everything else in motion, as the person whose happiness was the occasion and whose death was the consequence, without the intervening substance of being a specific person, with specific thoughts and specific feelings about the specific threshold she was standing on. But she was there. She was real. She had a face and a way of speaking and opinions about things, and things she was looking forward to and things she was apprehensive about, and everything else that a person has on the night before the significant change. She had, presumably, some awareness of John Rivers, in the way that people have awareness of the colleagues and associates of the person they are about to marry, the peripheral knowledge of someone who exists in the professional life of the person you love rather than in your own life directly. Whether she knew anything about the depth of his feeling is unknown, whether anyone told her, whether the captain knew and had mentioned it, whether she had observed it herself in some encounter between them and understood it for what it was, is not in the record. The record is silent about her, almost completely. This is one of the ways in which the Lady Lovibond legend is a story of its time, a story that reflects the assumptions of 1748, about whose interior life was worth preserving and whose was not. The captain and the first mate are both named. The first mate's psychology is the engine of the plot. The captain's happiness is the context. And the woman whose happiness and death frame the whole story is unnamed and unknowable, present as a factor in everyone else's story rather than as a person with her own. And yet she is the centre of it. Everything orbits her. The captain's happiness orbited her. John Rivers' pain orbited her. The wedding voyage that ended in disaster was in honour of her and the captain's union. The Goodwin Sands received her along with everyone else. And the legend that has been told about all of this for 270 years is, at its deepest level, a story about what it costs when a person becomes, in someone else's mind, less a person and more an object of desire, something to be had or lost rather than someone to be known. This is not a moral attached to the story after the fact. It is embedded in the structure of what happened. Rivers' pain, whatever its depth, and whatever its legitimacy as pain, was a pain that had turned the woman it centred on into a representation of what he wanted rather than a person with her own existence independent of his wanting. He did not speak to her. He did not reveal himself to her. He did not give her the information she would have needed to respond or to help, or to refuse in any meaningful way. He kept her inside his own experience, as a figure in his own drama, and in doing so he removed from her the possibility of being an actor in her own life, where his feelings were concerned. This is not unusual. This is, if anything, one of the most common patterns in the experience of unrequited love, the pattern in which the person who is loved from a distance is more an image than a person, more a projection screen for feeling than a human being with their own complexity and their own agency. The beloved becomes, in this pattern, someone who belongs to the interior life of the lover rather than to the world, someone who is carried internally rather than encountered externally, And this internalization is both the source of the feeling's intensity and the source of its danger, because the internal image does not correspond to the actual person, and the gap between them creates a space where anything can grow. What grew in rivers, in that gap, was what we know it became. The story does not give us the steps between the internalized image and the turned wheel. It gives us the beginning and the end, and asks us to understand the middle without being shown it. This is, in a sense, the story's mercy. It does not dwell in the steps between the feeling and the act, does not linger in the particular darkness of what it looks like when pain of a certain kind crosses into action. It simply notes that the wheel was turned, that the course was set, that the sands received what came to them. The wedding morning, when it came, was the kind of morning that February sometimes produces in England, a morning of surprising brightness after a cold night, with frost on the ground and a pale blue sky and the particular clarity of cold winter air that makes distant things look sharp and near. It would have been a good morning for a departure. The captain would have been pleased with the conditions. The passengers would have been cheerful, wrapped in their winter coats against the cold but warmed by the occasion, by the noise and colour of a wedding morning in a harbour town. The ship was waiting at the quay, as ships wait, with the patient stillness of a vessel that is ready to move but has not yet moved, that is fully prepared for the voyage ahead and is simply waiting for the people in the wind. The Lady Lovibond at the quay on the morning of February the 1st, 1748, was all the things she was supposed to be, sound, provisioned, crewed, and ready. The destination was Portugal. The weather was favourable, the captain was happy, the bride was lovely in her wedding dress, the guests were cheerful, and John Rivers was at the bow with his eyes on the water. The gap between that morning and the thing that happened that night is the gap that the legend has been measuring for 270 years, not in distance, because it was only a matter of hours, but in meaning, in the immeasurable distance between what a day begins as and what it becomes, between the happiness of a February morning in a harbour town and the cold of the Channel at 11 o'clock at night with the Goodwins under the keel. That gap is what stories are made of. That gap is what keeps them alive. Not the happiness of the morning, which was complete and required no story, but the distance between the morning and the night, the distance that a wheel turned 2 degrees in the wrong direction can produce, the distance that a feeling carried too long in the dark can produce when it finally acts. The Lady Lovibond sailed that distance in the course of a single day and a single night. The story of her sailing that distance has been told for 270 years, and will be told for however many more years the people who live near the Goodwins find reason to tell it, which is to say, probably for a very long time. The wedding dress is in the sand with the rest of it, or has been in the sand and is now part of the sand, as all organic things eventually become part of the sand. The morning brightness is gone. What remains is the story, and the sands, and the occasional February night when something is seen near the sands that matches the description in the legend, and the question that keeps being asked, in various forms, by various people, what does it mean when the dead come back to the place where they died and sail the course that killed them, endlessly, without apparent purpose, without apparent knowledge that they are doing it again? If you are drifting now, let yourself go. The story will be here when you return. Subscribe so the next one is waiting. Sleep well. By 1898, the Goodwin Sands had acquired a permanent infrastructure of warning. The lightships that had been placed near the sands in the early 18th century had been improved and supplemented over the following century and a half. There were now 3 lightships assigned to the Goodwins, stationed at the North Goodwin, the South Goodwin, and the East Goodwin positions, their red hulls visible by day and their lanterns visible by night, making the approach to the sands comprehensively marked for any vessel with a navigator paying attention. The lightships were staffed by teams of men who lived aboard them in rotating shifts, relieved periodically by tender vessels that brought food and mail and fresh crew and took the previous crew back to shore. Life aboard a lightship was its own particular discipline. The vessel did not move, or moved only slightly within the limits of her anchor chain. The horizon was always the same horizon. The weather came and went and came again, and the crew rode it out without the option of seeking shelter that any ordinary vessel would have. The work was maintenance and watch-keeping, the continuous labour of keeping the light burning and keeping the vessel in good condition, in an environment that corroded and deteriorated everything with steady persistence. It was not a romantic life. It was a patient life, a life of small tasks and long stretches, and the particular companionship of men who have no choice but to know each other well. The crew of the South Goodwin lightship in February of 1898 were, by all accounts, professional men who took their responsibilities seriously, and who were not given to flights of imagination, or to the elaboration of what they observed into what they wished to have observed. This is relevant because the account from the South Goodwin lightship crew of the first days of February 1898 is the most detailed, the most carefully recorded, and the most officially attested of all the Lady Lovibond accounts. It exists in the records of Trinity House, the organisation responsible for the maintenance of lighthouses and lightships around the British coast, and it was made not as a supernatural report but as an official incident log. The log entry records that on the night of February 1st, 1898, one of the officers of the South Goodwin lightship observed, while on watch, a three-masted sailing vessel on a course that would take her directly onto the sands. The officer described the vessel as appearing to be a schooner, as having lanterns burning with a yellowish light that differed from the standard white light of modern maritime lamps, and as moving at a speed consistent with moderate wind in her sails, which was unusual because at the time of the observation the wind was light and the sea was calm, conditions under which the apparent speed of the vessel did not correspond to what the conditions should have produced. The officer attempted to contact the vessel by signal. He used the lightship's signal lantern to flash warnings in the direction of the approaching ship. The ship did not respond to the signals. She continued on her course. The officer called the second watch member and both men observed the vessel for a period which the log records as approximately 8 minutes. At the end of this period the vessel was no longer visible, though the conditions had not changed and there had been no obvious reason for her disappearance, no fog, no squall, no passing cloud cover that could have obscured her. The log entry notes the incident with the particular flatness of official records. Vessel observed, signals given, vessel did not respond, vessel not subsequently located. It does not mention the Lady Lovibond. It does not mention the 50-year anniversary. It does not draw any conclusion beyond the factual observation of what was seen and what was done. And yet the coincidence of the date, the description of the vessel, and the behaviour of the lights was sufficient for the account to be noted and discussed by those who subsequently examined the lightship logs, and for the 1898 observation to be added to the growing body of Lady Lovibond sightings. The Trinity House records from this period are generally reliable sources for maritime incidents. The organisation was careful about documentation. The men who kept the logs were trained to record what they observed accurately and to distinguish between what they had seen and what they inferred or believed. The South Goodwin log entry for February 1898, in the context of these records, is unusual precisely because it describes something that the officer clearly did not have an ordinary explanation for, something that he recorded accurately and without embellishment, and then left as an open question, a gap in the ordinary pattern of logged events that subsequent readers have been filling with their own interpretations ever since. There is something valuable in that gap. The officer did not say he had seen a ghost. He said he had seen a vessel behaving in an unusual way, and then not seen it any more. The gap between those two observations, the vessel there and then not there, is where the story lives. In the space between what can be accounted for and what cannot, between the ordinary and the inexplicable, between the seen and the gone. All ghost stories live in that gap. All ghost stories are, at their core, the record of that gap, the place where something was and then was not, and the human need to understand why. By 1898, the world that the Lady Lovibond had sailed out of in 1748 was unrecognisable. Steam had replaced sail for almost all commercial purposes. The ships that moved through the Channel in 1898 were iron-hulled, coal-fired, equipped with whistles and electric lights and telegraphs, subject to regulations and inspections and reporting requirements that their 18th century predecessors could not have imagined. The Goodwin Sands were still dangerous because the Goodwin Sands were geological rather than technological, and were indifferent to the improvements in ship design, but the lightships were better, the charts were better, the communications were better, and the loss rate had declined from the catastrophic levels of earlier centuries. But sail was not entirely gone. There were still working sailing vessels on the Channel in 1898, mostly in the coastal trade, fishing boats and smaller cargo vessels that could not justify the capital cost of steam engines, and that operated in the margins and the shorter routes where sail was still practical. These vessels were increasingly anachronistic against the background of the steamship-dominated Channel, and their visible difference from the majority of shipping gave them a character that they would not have had in an earlier period, a quality of antiquity, of belonging to an earlier world, that made a sighting of an unusual sailing vessel more charged with meaning than such a sighting would have been in 1748 when most ships were sail. A three-masted schooner in 1898 was already a somewhat old-fashioned sight, a three-masted schooner with yellowish lanterns and a course set for the Goodwins, behaving as if the lightships were not there and the sands were not marked, and it was still 1748, was a sight that carried its own interpretation with it, that came preloaded with the awareness of what it might be. The men on the South Goodwin lightship in 1898 would have known the Lady Lovibond story. The story was part of the culture of the Goodwins, part of the occupational heritage of anyone who kept watch near those sands. Whether that knowledge influenced what they saw, or whether what they saw was entirely independent of what they knew, is the question that cannot be answered. The anniversary of 1898 generated more public attention than previous ones had. This was partly because the press in 1898 was larger and more comprehensive than it had been in 1748, or 1798, or even 1848, and partly because the legend had been sufficiently established by this point that there was a recognised story to report, a template that made the new sightings comprehensible to readers who might otherwise have dismissed them as sailors' tales. Newspapers in Kent and in London carried accounts of the anniversary and the sightings, and the Lady Lovibond became, for a brief period, a nationally known story rather than a local one. Some of this coverage was sceptical, as Victorian and Edwardian newspaper coverage of supernatural phenomena tended to be, wrapping the material in a frame of rational doubt that simultaneously allowed the journalist to report the interesting story and to maintain the editorial dignity of not actually believing it. But even the sceptical coverage acknowledged the consistency of the accounts, the way the sightings over 3 successive 50-year periods had produced descriptions of a vessel matching the general characteristics of a schooner of the Lady Lovibond's period, with the unusual lantern colour and the impossible course. The skeptics explained this consistency variously as legend contamination, optical phenomena, and the collective desire of a community to maintain a story that gave their waters a particular identity. The believers said the ship was there. The skeptics said the believers saw what they expected to see. Both positions remain available. What does not remain available, because it was settled long before the arguing began, is the 50 feet of water and sand that separates the surface from the Lady Lovibond's resting place. Whatever else is uncertain, that is not uncertain. She is there. The sand has her. And every 50 years something happens near the South Goodwin that people in positions to observe report and argue about, and cannot quite explain away, and cannot quite confirm, and cannot quite leave alone. Drift now a little further towards sleep, if sleep is where you are going. The lightship is behind us, its red hull growing smaller as the story carries us on. The channel is wide and the night is long, and there are still more things to know, more water to cross, more years to move through before the story reaches the present and the present reaches you. There is a library of ghost ships, not a library that exists in any building, not a catalogue that can be consulted in any archive, but an accumulated body of stories from every maritime culture that has ever existed. A tradition of the supernatural at sea that is as old as the human practice of going out on the water, and as widespread as the human capacity for being afraid of what the water contains and what it does not return. The Flying Dutchman is the most famous of the ghost ships, the one that has travelled furthest from its origins in Dutch and German maritime legend into the general cultural awareness, carried there partly by the operatic treatment of Richard Wagner in the 19th century and partly by its own narrative elegance. The story of a captain who swore to round Cape Horn in a storm if it took him until the Day of Judgment, and who is still out there, still rounding, still condemned to his eternal voyage by the terms of an oath that no force in heaven or earth has seen fit to release him from. The Dutchman is a different kind of story from the Lady Lovibond, a story of defiance punished rather than jealousy acted upon. But the underlying structure is the same: the ship that cannot reach port, the voyage that cannot be completed, the sea that keeps what it has been given. There is the Mary Celeste, which is not quite a ghost ship story in the same sense, but which occupies the same psychological territory. The abandoned vessel found drifting in good condition, with no sign of her crew, no evidence of what had happened, no explanation that could survive serious examination. the Mary Celeste has generated more theories than almost any other maritime mystery, and all of the theories together have not produced an answer, because the sea did not choose to preserve whatever answer there is. The ship was there, the crew was not, the rest is inference and imagination. There is the Carroll A. Deering, a 5-masted schooner found aground on Diamond Shoals off the North Carolina coast in 1921. Her crew gone, the lifeboats gone, the anchors gone, the navigation equipment gone, and the galley stove still burning with food still cooking. There is the Orang Medan, whose crew were all found dead in conditions that no subsequent investigation could explain. There are dozens of others, hundreds of others, if you include the smaller stories that circulated in local communities around the world's coasts. Stories of ships seen where they should not be seen, ships that did not respond to signals, ships that appeared and disappeared in conditions that made no ordinary sense. What all these stories share, beyond the obvious quality of being maritime, is the quality of the unfinished. The ghost ship is always a ship that has not arrived, a voyage that has not ended, a crew that has not reached wherever it was going. This is the defining characteristic of the genre, and it is also what makes it so persistently resonant. The sense that something has been interrupted rather than completed, that somewhere in the world or in the water, or in some category of being that the living do not have direct access to, the voyage is still in progress. The Lady Lovibond fits into this tradition with particular neatness, because her unfinished quality is not just the unfinished quality of a voyage interrupted by disaster, it is the unfinished quality of a specific human situation. A wedding that ended before the honeymoon was over, a love that was destroyed before it could grow into whatever it was supposed to become, a crime that was committed in circumstances so extreme that the ordinary categories of justice and resolution do not apply. John Rivers is still at the helm, the Reeds are still below decks, the Goodwins are still to the east. None of this has been resolved because none of it can be resolved, because the resolution would require something that has not happened, and perhaps cannot happen. Some of the literature on maritime ghost lore approaches these stories from the perspective of what the sea means psychologically, which is a perspective that has a long history in human culture, going back much further than the development of psychology as a formal discipline. The sea in mythological and literary tradition is the place of the unconscious, the place of the unknown, the place where the ordinary rules of the waking world do not apply. Sailors who go out on the sea are crossing into a territory that is not fully subject to human control, not fully subject to human understanding, and the things that happen at sea partake of the quality of that territory. Ghost ships, in this reading, are the sea's way of holding what it has been given and reflecting it back to the living in a form that the living can partly comprehend. The sea has the Lady Lovibond. The sea returns the Lady Lovibond in the form of light and the appearance of a ship on an impossible course, in the form of a story that the living keep telling because they have not finished thinking about what it means. The ship is the memory of a specific event given back in a form that is less specific, more general, more available to the living as a way of thinking about something larger than the original event. The original event reduced to its essentials is this: a man was in pain. The pain was not bearable. He did something that could not be undone. Everyone died. This sequence is not unusual in the history of human violence. It is, in its broad outlines, a sequence that has been repeated throughout human history in many contexts and under many kinds of conditions. What gives the Lady Lovibond its particular resonance is the specificity of the setting and the nature of the pain. A wedding voyage, a jealous first mate, the act of turning the wheel 2 degrees, the Goodwin Sands 4 miles east. These specific details make the story feel real in a way that more general accounts of human violence do not, and the reality of the specific details gives the legendary elements their weight. There is also the question of what the 50-year interval means, or whether it means anything beyond a narrative convenience. 50 years is close enough to a human lifetime to carry the feeling of generational significance. A child born in 1748, when the Lady Lovibond sank, would have been 50 years old in 1798, old enough to have heard the story of the sinking as a childhood memory, and to experience the 1798 sighting as the confirmation of something they had carried for half a century. A child born in 1798 would have been 50 years old in 1848. A child born in 1848 would have been 50 years old in 1898. The Lady Lovibond moves through generations at the rate of generations. This could be a coincidence. There's no particular reason why a supernatural phenomenon, if it were real, should appear on a 50-year interval rather than any other interval. The 50-year regularity is more likely a product of the legend than a description of reality. The 1798 sighting was noted as 50 years after the sinking. The 50-year interval was established in the telling, and the 1848 and 1898 sightings were partly constructed around the expectation that the 50 years were up. This is not dishonesty or fabrication. It is the way that human narrative works, the way that pattern recognition operates in the telling and retelling of stories, the way that a date can become a magnet for events that happen around it. None of this means that nothing was seen. The South Goodwin Lightship log for 1898 was an official document, not a legend. The fishermen who reported the 1798 sighting were reporting what they believed they had observed, not what they had been told to observe. The collier that adjusted its course in 1848 to investigate something near the sands was responding to a genuine observation, not a story. The observations exist. The interpretations are what vary, and the interpretations are what we are left with, in the absence of the phenomena themselves, in the absence of any recording equipment on the Goodwins in February of 1748 or 1798 or 1848 or 1898. What the sea keeps, it keeps. What the sea shows, it shows when it chooses to show it and not before. The Lady Lovibond is somewhere in the Goodwins under the sand in the cold. The story of the Lady Lovibond is somewhere in the community of everyone who has ever heard it, in the cold of their memory waiting to be told again. Both the ship and the story are forms of keeping, different kinds of preservation, the one by sand and cold, and the one by language and repetition. And now, as the story approaches its later chapters, as the years move forward toward the 20th century and beyond, the questions that remain are the questions the story has always been asking. Will she return in 1948? Will she return in 1998? Has she already returned? And what does it mean in a world of satellite navigation and GPS positioning and radar that can detect a vessel through fog and darkness and weather? What does it mean that people near the Goodwin Sands in February still sometimes report something that should not be there? The Dutch maritime tradition from which the Flying Dutchman emerged understood the ghost ship as a fundamentally cautionary phenomenon, a warning to the living rather than a haunting by the dead. The ship that could not reach port was a reminder to the living sailor of what failure looked like, of what the consequences were of pride or oath-breaking or any of the other faults that the legend associated with the genesis of the haunting. This cautionary quality was part of what gave the legend its longevity. It was a useful story, a story that served a practical purpose in a community where the consequences of certain kinds of behaviour were precisely the consequences the story described. The Lady Lovibond has a cautionary dimension that is less explicit than the Flying Dutchman's but no less present. The consequences of carrying a feeling too long without speaking it, of letting pain compress into something that acts in spite of knowledge, of being at the helm of something important when the part of you that is in control is not the part that should be in control. These are consequences that the legend enacts on the Goodwins every 50 years, or seems to enact in the repetition of the same course and the same end and the same yellow lanterns going nowhere and arriving nowhere. The Goodwin Sands have given things back sometimes. This is the other side of the story that the ship swallower reputation obscures. The sands do not only take. In certain conditions, in certain seasons, when the tides run in a particular way, and the wind moves the sand in a particular direction, things that have been buried for years or decades or centuries are temporarily exposed, brought to the surface or close to it, visible to the divers and the survey vessels that work these waters in the modern period and, in earlier times, to the deal boatmen who knew the sands well enough to recognise when something was exposed that had not been exposed before. The exposure of wrecks on the Goodwins is a function of the dynamic nature of the bank itself. The sands are not static, they shift. The tides and the storms move the sand continuously, and the movement is not uniform so that a particular section of the bank might accumulate sand for a period and then lose sand for a period, burying things and then uncovering them in a cycle that has nothing to do with the intentions of the people who put those things there. Ships that were buried for 50 years have been known to reappear on the Goodwins after a particularly severe winter storm. their hulls exposed to the air and the light for the first time in half a century before the following tides bury them again. The appearance of a previously buried wreck on the Goodwins is an event of some local significance. It attracts the attention of archaeologists and maritime historians and the salvage professionals who have always worked these waters, and it also attracts the more general attention of people who find the sands interesting in the way that places with large historical accumulations tend to attract general interest. The appearance of a wreck is a reminder that the archive is real, that the ships are there, that the 2,000 vessels and their contents, and in some cases their crews, are genuinely present in the sand 4 miles from the Kent coast. In the winter of 1973, a severe storm exposed a section of what appeared to be an 18th century vessel on the southern part of the Goodwins. The exposure was brief, lasting perhaps 2 or 3 tidal cycles before the sand reclaimed the wreck, but long enough for several photographs to be taken and for a survey to be conducted that established the general dimensions and approximate period of the vessel. The survey noted that the exposed timbers included what appeared to be sections of the lower hull of a 3-masted vessel, consistent in construction style and materials with English merchant shipbuilding of the early to mid-18th century. Whether this was the Lady Lovibond is one of the questions that the subsequent literature was unable to resolve. The dimensions were consistent with a vessel of the Lady Lovibond's approximate size and type. The construction period was consistent with the 1740s or thereabouts. The location was consistent with the area where the Lady Lovibond was reported to have grounded. But consistency is not identity, and the Goodwins contain many vessels of similar period and similar size, and the photographic and survey evidence from a brief exposure in 1973 is not sufficient to establish a definitive identification. The impossibility of definitive identification is itself part of the story in a way. The Lady Lovibond resists being pinned down. She resists the kind of conclusive documentation that would convert her from a legend into a merely historical event, that would translate her from the story that she has become into the data that she originally was. Every time an investigation reaches the point where a definitive answer might be possible, the conditions change, the sand shifts, the wreck is reburied, the weather prevents further investigation, the evidence turns out to be insufficient for a firm conclusion. The ship is always almost there, always almost found, always retreating back into the uncertainty that has been her characteristic since the first of the 50-year sightings in 1798. This quality of almostness, of presence without confirmation, is not exclusive to the Lady Lovibond legend. It is characteristic of the whole class of historical mysteries that involve locations rather than individuals, places where something happened that has not been found or confirmed in the material record, the battlefield where an ancient army was destroyed, the site of a lost city mentioned in classical sources, the wreck of a famous ship. These are all places that carry the quality of the almost, the tantalizingly close that is still definitively not quite there. The almostness creates a particular kind of attention, a kind of watchfulness that is different from the attention that certain knowledge produces, because certain knowledge is a closed thing, finished, while the almost invites continuing looking, continuing wondering, continuing return. The deal boatmen who have worked the edges of the Goodwins for generations have their own relationship with this quality of almost. They know the sands the way you know a landscape you have lived in for a long time, not by map or description, but by direct and repeated experience, by the accumulated pattern of thousands of crossings and thousands of observations. They know where the sand is deep and where it is shallow, where the tides run fast and where they slow, where the feeding is good and where it is not, where the wrecks are that have been exposed enough to be known, and where the wrecks are that have never been seen but are inferred from the way the tides behave over them, the slight differences in the current that a submerged object of sufficient size produces in the water above it. Some of the older deal men, in accounts gathered over the years, have spoken of a quality they associate with a specific area of the sands, an area in the southern part of the bank, that they describe in terms that are difficult to specify, but that cluster around the idea of difference. The water there feels different, they say, or looks different in certain light conditions, or the current runs in a slightly different way. None of them claim anything supernatural by this. They are practical men describing practical observations, but the area they describe as feeling different is, in 2 or 3 of these accounts, consistent with the area where the Lady Lovibond is believed to have grounded. The temperature of the water over a buried wreck can differ from the temperature of the surrounding water because the wreck creates a thermal environment in the sediment above it that is distinct from the sediment elsewhere, and this temperature difference can produce slight variations in the surface conditions of the water above. This is measurable, in the modern period, with the right instruments. Whether experienced fishermen can detect such subtle variations through the feel of their boats on the water is a question that sits in the uncertain territory between the demonstrable and the merely plausible, the territory that the Lady Lovibond has always occupied. The Goodwins keep their secrets with the same equanimity that they keep their ships. They do not protect their secrets. They do not hide them, in the sense of making any deliberate effort at concealment. They simply contain them, in the way that very large volumes of sand contain things, through the passive mechanism of depth and weight, and the continuous movement that buries exposed things and exposes buried things, according to a rhythm that has no reference to what human beings would find convenient or satisfying. The secrets are there. The access to the secrets is limited by the medium in which they are stored. The sand is the archive, and the sand is also the lock, and the sand does not give out keys. And so the Lady Lovibond remains in both registers simultaneously. She is in the sand, almost certainly in some form, timber and iron, and the material remains of a working ship that sailed out of Gravesend 270 years ago and did not return. She is also in the story, definitively, in the form of a legend that has been accumulating detail and resonance for 2.5 centuries, and that shows no sign of losing its capacity to grip the imagination of people who hear it. Both forms of existence are real. Both will continue. And every 50 years, or approximately every 50 years, the two registers touch, and something appears near the sands that bridges the gap between the material and the legendary, that is not quite one and not quite the other, that is exactly the kind of thing that the Lady Lovibond has always been. Sleep is nearby. You can feel it the way you feel weather coming, the way the air changes before rain, the way the quality of everything shifts slightly in the minutes before the body gives itself over to rest. The story has been long, the water has been wide, and the sands have been patient through all of it, patient in the way they have always been patient, which is the patience of things that have no particular investment in any outcome, that simply are, in the cold and the dark and the slow movement of the tide. Let the sands be patient. Let the cold be the cold. Let the distance between 1748 and wherever you are now be the enormous distance it is, measured in time and in everything that time contains, and let that distance be a comfort rather than a weight, the comfortable distance of the historical, of the past that is present only as story, present only as the soft images that remain after the telling, the yellow lanterns and the February dark and the 3 masts against a sky full of stars. By the time February 1948 arrived, the Goodwin Sands had seen more than they had bargained for, even by their own generous accounting. The Second World War had visited the Channel with an intensity that made every previous period of maritime traffic look sparse and orderly. The sands had swallowed warships and aircraft and men in numbers that were difficult to contemplate. The Channel itself, in the years between 1939 and 1945, had become one of the most militarized stretches of water in the world, strewn with mines and patrolled by aircraft and contested by fleets on both sides. And through all of it, the Goodwins had maintained their patient indifference, accepting whatever came to them, warships and merchant vessels and aircraft alike, with the same unhurried absorption that had been their character for millennia. In 1948, the war had been over for 3 years, but the evidence of it was still everywhere in the coastal landscape of Kent. The concrete defences that had been built against the expected German invasion, the pillboxes and anti-tank obstacles and barriers that had transformed the beaches into military installations, were still in place in various states of preservation and neglect. The beaches themselves had been cleared of mines, mostly, but the work was not complete, and there were areas where the clearance teams had not yet been and where the warning signs were still in place. The coastal towns were rebuilding, the way all of Britain was rebuilding, slowly and with the pragmatic focus on what was necessary over what was desirable that characterised the post-war period. It was not, in other words, a particularly romantic or atmospheric time for a ghost ship legend to reassert itself. The people of the Kent coast in 1948 had more immediate and more material concerns than the 50-year anniversary of an 18th century maritime disaster. Rationing was still in effect. housing was short. The fishing industry was returning to something like normal operation after years of restriction. The Goodwins themselves had acquired new dangers in the form of wartime debris, and the lightship crews were dealing with the practical aftermath of a conflict that had made their already difficult jobs considerably more complicated. And yet the 50 years were up, and in February of 1948, around the anniversary of the 1st of February, there were reports. The 1948 accounts are different in character from the earlier ones. They come from a different kind of world, a world with telephones and motor vehicles and radio communications, a world in which the isolation of the coastal communities had been largely broken down by modernity, a world in which the people making the reports were less embedded in the local legend and its expectations, and more likely to be casual observers, people who had heard something about the Lady Lovibond story and who happened to be near the sands around the anniversary date, and who saw something they could not immediately explain. One account from 1948 is attributed to a Coast Guard officer stationed at a position on the Kent coast, a man who was performing routine watch duties on the night of February the 1st, and who recorded in his duty log an observation of lights near the Goodwins that he could not identify or explain. The lights he described were yellowish in character, which was at that point an unusual colour for maritime lights, since the technology of maritime lighting had moved comprehensively to electric lights producing white light. A yellowish light at sea in 1948 was anomalous, in a way that a yellowish light in 1798 would not have been, because in 1798 all maritime lanterns burned oil or candles and produced exactly that yellowish light. The Coast Guard officer's account notes that the lights appeared to be moving in a direction consistent with a vessel heading toward the sands, that they maintained consistent spacing consistent with the running lights of a single vessel, and that they disappeared after approximately 6 minutes without any obvious explanation. He reported the observation to his superior, and a check was made of vessel traffic in the area, which revealed no vessel that corresponded to the position and behaviour he described. The account was not published at the time. It appears in the Lady Lovibond literature only in accounts written after the fact, drawing on records that were made accessible in subsequent decades. Whether the Coast Guard officer knew about the Lady Lovibond and the 50-year anniversary before he made his observation, or whether he was simply a man doing his job who saw something he could not explain and recorded it correctly, is not established in the available sources. This uncertainty is characteristic of the 1948 accounts generally. They are accounts from a more documented world than 1748 or 1798, from a world that produced more records, but the records that survive about this particular observation are incomplete in ways that make the question of prior knowledge unanswerable. The post-war period in Britain was, in a particular way, a period of heightened attention to loss. The country had lost a substantial portion of a generation, had lost cities to bombing, had lost an empire in the process of winning a war, and was in the middle of the long, slow reckoning with what all that loss meant. Ghost stories do well in periods of acute collective loss, because they speak to something that the culture is already thinking about, the question of what happens to the dead, whether the dead are truly gone, whether the people who were there and then were not there are simply absent, or are somewhere in a condition that might be described as presence without visibility. The Lady Lovibond in 1948 was a story about loss that was 200 years old, which was both far enough away to be safely historical and close enough to be emotionally available. A story about the dead who could not leave, about the ship that kept coming back because there was no resolution for her, no arrival, no destination that could be reached. In a country that had spent 6 years feeding its young men into a war, the image of the dead who could not rest had a particular resonance that went beyond the specifics of the 18th century maritime disaster. The 1948 reports did not generate the same press attention that the 1898 accounts had generated, partly because the press in 1948 had more pressing material to deal with, and partly because the cultural appetite for supernatural stories had shifted since 1898. The 20th century, with its 2 world wars and its atomic weapons and its rapidly accelerating technological transformation of daily life, had produced a relationship with the supernatural that was different from the Victorian one, less systematically curious and more ambivalently dismissive, more willing to use ghost stories as entertainment and less willing to treat them as phenomena worthy of serious investigation. But the legend persisted. It persisted in the local knowledge of the Kent coast and in the literature that had accumulated around it by this point, and it persisted in the structure that had been established over 2 centuries. The 50-year interval, the date of February the 1st, the three-masted schooner with the yellow lights on a course for the sands. These were the fixed elements of the story, the elements that had proven stable across the changes of 200 years, and they remained stable in 1948 as they had been stable in every previous generation. What changes in the story over time is not the story itself, but the world around the story. The Goodwin Sands do not change, not in any way that matters across the span of human memory. The channel does not change in its essential character. The cold of February does not change. What changes is the technology of the ships that sail past the sands, the sophistication of the navigation equipment, the comprehensiveness of the communication systems, the expectations of the people doing the watching. And what stays the same in the reports is the thing seen, the lights, the 3 masts, the impossible course, the disappearance. The ship was lost on this date in 1748. The ship was seen on this date in 1798 and 1848 and 1898. The ship may have been seen on this date in 1948 by a Coast Guard officer who wrote it in his log and then went home to his rationed supper and did not think about it again until someone found the log decades later and added his account to the growing archive of the Lady Lovibond legend. The archive grows, the sands are patient. The next 50 years were already beginning to pass. There are things that the archive does not record, things that happen between the anniversaries, in the ordinary Februaries, in the years when there is no particular reason to be watching, and no particular reason to expect anything unusual near the sands. The fishermen who work the edges of the Goodwins in February do not always write down what they see. The crew of the lightship in the long winter watches does not always enter every observation in the log, particularly if the observation is one that resists easy categorization and that the man making it is not certain he wants his colleagues to read. The Coast Guard patrols, in the decades between the anniversaries, notice things near the sands that they note to themselves and do not report, because the thing noticed does not constitute a hazard or an emergency, and because the reporting of it would require an explanation that the observer does not have. This is the ordinary silence that surrounds unusual observations in any professional environment, where the unusual is expected to be explicable, and where the failure to explain is taken as a failure of the observer rather than as a property of the thing observed. The Goodwins produce unusual observations. They have always produced unusual observations. The conditions above the sands, with their particular combination of shallow water and shifting sand, and the atmospheric effects of the tidal flow, produce optical phenomena and acoustic phenomena, and the kinds of shadow and light that the mind reaches for familiar shapes to explain. A professional who sees something near the Goodwins that resembles a vessel does not necessarily conclude that the vessel is the Lady Lovibond. He concludes first that there must be an explanation, and he looks for the explanation, and if the explanation is not forthcoming, he concludes that he must have been mistaken and he moves on. But the 1948 observation persisted in the official record because the Coast Guard officer was thorough, because his training inclined him to document what he observed rather than what he could explain, and because the log in which he recorded his observation was preserved in the ordinary way of institutional records and eventually became accessible to those who were looking for it. Most of the observations that might have been made in the years between 1898 and 1948, in the ordinary watches of the ordinary Februaries, were not recorded or were recorded, and not preserved or were preserved and not found. The archive that exists is almost certainly a fraction of the archive that was made, and the archive that was made is almost certainly a fraction of the observations that occurred. The 1948 sighting, such as it was, settled into the legend as the 4th data point in the 50-year sequence, joining 1798 and 1848 and 1898 as the anchors of the pattern. The pattern was now 3 confirmed sightings and 1 probable sighting across 200 years, which is not a large data set by any scientific standard, but which is, for a legend of this age and this character, a remarkably consistent one. The anniversary structure held, the February date held, the description of the lights held, the disappearance without explanation held. What the 1948 account added to the others was not new detail, but confirmation. The confirmation that the pattern had not broken in the face of modernity, that whatever the pattern was, it was not something that the war or the technology of the 20th century had disrupted or made impossible. In 1948, A person holding the full ledger of the Lady Lovibond legend could look at 4 entries spanning 2 centuries and see in them a shape, a regularity that was either the shape of something real or the shape of something that the human mind constructs from scattered data when the scattered data fits a template it already has. The question of which it was remained open, the way questions of this type always remain open, because the evidence is always insufficient for certainty in either direction, and because the legend itself is more durable than any evidence that might be brought against it or in its favour. In 1998, the world was a very different place from 1748, in almost every particular that could be named. The ships that moved through the channel carried GPS positioning systems that could locate them to within meters anywhere on the surface of the Earth. They carried radar that could detect other vessels through fog and darkness and heavy weather. They carried radio systems and satellite communication systems and emergency beacons that could summon help from halfway around the world. They carried automatic identification systems that broadcast their position and course and speed continuously to anyone with a receiver tuned to the right frequency. The Goodwin Sands were still there because the Goodwin Sands do not care about the passage of technology, but a modern vessel navigated with attention and basic competence would not end up on the Goodwins by accident. The lightships that had guarded the sands since the early 18th century had been replaced, in the latter decades of the 20th century, by automated light buoys, which did not require crews and which performed the warning function of the lightships with less expense and less human risk. The South Goodwin lightship, whose crew had logged the 1898 sighting, was no longer staffed. The tradition of the lightship keeper who maintained watch through winter nights and observed unusual phenomena near the sands had ended. The warnings were still there. The watchers were largely gone. This absence of human watchers on the sands created an interesting situation in February of 1998. The anniversary of the Lady Lovibond sinking was well known by this point. The legend had been thoroughly documented in the accumulated literature of Kent maritime history, in books of local folklore, in television documentaries about the Goodwins, in newspaper feature articles that appeared with some regularity around the 50-year marks. The legend was, by 1998, a piece of cultural heritage rather than a living community belief, the kind of thing that people knew about because it was part of the heritage of the coast, rather than because they had absorbed it through direct community transmission over generations. In 1998, the anniversary of February the 1st attracted a small but notable amount of deliberate attention. There were people who went to the coast specifically because of the anniversary, people who found the Lady Lovibond story compelling enough to make the trip to Kent in February in the hope or expectation of seeing something near the sands. This was not a large crowd. It was the kind of attention that ghost ship legends attract in the modern period, the attention of enthusiasts rather than believers. People who found the story interesting and who would have enjoyed a sighting without quite committing to the belief that a sighting was literally what they thought it was. Among the people who reported observations near the Goodwins in February of 1998, several accounts have circulated in the subsequent literature on the Lady Lovibond. The accounts vary in the degree to which they can be verified, and in the precision of the observations they describe. Some are second- or third-hand reports, assembled from conversations rather than contemporaneous records. Others are more direct but still subject to the problems of human perception and the expectations created by prior knowledge of the legend. One account that has been cited relatively often is from a member of the crew of a motor vessel passing through the channel in the first days of February 1998. The crew member, who was on watch at the time, described seeing what appeared to be the lights of a sailing vessel on the port bow, in a position that would have placed the vessel near the Goodwins. He described the lights as unusual in colour, yellowish rather than the expected white of modern navigation lights. He watched the vessel for several minutes and then turned to call his watch partner, and when he looked back the lights were gone. He checked the radar, which showed nothing in the area where the lights had been. The radar showing nothing is interesting. If something was there, the radar should have shown it. Modern marine radar is not a perfect instrument in all conditions, and there are phenomena that can produce false echoes or obscure real ones. But a three-masted schooner of the Lady Lovibond's approximate size in reasonable sea conditions should have produced a radar return. The absence of a radar return for the observed lights is one of the details that makes the 1998 accounts particularly interesting to those who find such things interesting. The lights were there visually but were not there on radar, which is either evidence that the visual observation was not of a physical vessel or evidence that something unusual was happening with either the radar or the atmosphere. The atmospheric conditions over the Goodwin Sands in February 1998 were the kind of conditions that can produce optical anomalies. A high-pressure system had settled over the southern North Sea in the days around the 1st of February, producing unusually calm conditions and cold, clear air over relatively warmer water. These are exactly the conditions that produce temperature inversions over the sea surface, and temperature inversions are exactly the conditions that produce looming effects, the apparent appearance of objects that are below the horizon or at unusual apparent heights, projected there by the bending of light through the temperature gradient at the boundary between the cold air and the warmer water. A looming in these conditions could produce the appearance of distant lights in an unexpected location. The lights might be from a vessel that was actually many miles away, appearing near the sands through the optical effect of the inversion. The unusual colour might be explained by the differential absorption of different wavelengths of light as they pass through the temperature gradient. The disappearance of the lights when the watch member looked away might be explained by the instability of the temperature inversion, which can shift and dissolve relatively quickly as the atmospheric conditions change. Or the lights were there and then they were not there, because what produces them only briefly and then is gone. In whatever way things that produce them are gone, there is no way to know. The 1998 accounts, like the accounts before them, exist in the category of the uncertain, the insufficiently documented, the observed but not confirmed. They add to the legend. They do not resolve it. They are not intended to resolve it. The legend is not a problem in search of a solution. It is a story in search of understanding, which is a different thing. An understanding is something that happens over time and through the accumulation of more story, rather than through the application of definitive explanation. The Goodwins in 1998 were the subject of renewed scientific and archaeological attention. A survey of the sands conducted in the 1990s using sonar imaging produced maps of the underwater topography that revealed the presence of numerous wrecks buried within the sand at various depths and in various states of preservation. The survey identified what appeared to be the remains of an 18th century vessel at a location consistent with the reported position of the Lady Lovibond, though the identification was tentative and the condition of the remains did not permit detailed examination from the surface. The possibility that the Lady Lovibond herself had been located within the sands gave the 1998 anniversary a quality that previous anniversaries had not had, a quality of material reality underlying the legend. The ship herself confirmed as being there, if not confirmed as the specific vessel that the survey identified. This was a different kind of existence from the existence of the legend, a physical existence, bones and timber in cold wet sand, the original event preserved in the sediment that had received it 250 years before. 250 years. Think of how many February 1st nights that is. Think of how many tides have passed over that location on the sands, how many storms have moved the sand around the buried hull, how many ships have passed above without knowing that anything was below. The Lady Lovibond has been there for all of that time, in the cold and the dark and the patient sand, while the world above her has changed beyond anything that Captain Reed or John Rivers or the new Mrs. Reed could have imagined, while history has piled itself in layers above the channel like the sand piles in layers above the wreck. And every 50 years, or approximately every 50 years, someone near the sands sees something that they cannot explain and that corresponds to the descriptions in the legend, and the story is told again. Not because the story resolves anything, because it is the story. Because some stories need to be told again at regular intervals, the way some things need to be remembered at regular intervals, the way grief needs to be revisited rather than simply stored, the way certain human experiences need to be held in language and narrative rather than allowed to dissolve into mere data. The fifth return, or what may have been the fifth return, came and went in 1998. The observers made their reports, the newspapers carried the anniversary articles, the enthusiasts went home to their ordinary lives, and the sands settled back into their own rhythm, which is the rhythm of the tides and the seasons and the very slow movement of sand through water, which is a rhythm that does not acknowledge any particular year or any particular February, that simply continues, the way the water continues, the way the cold continues, the way the dark continues. Here is a thing you might not have considered. what it sounds like on the deck of a sailing ship at night in the middle of the English Channel in February. It is not quiet, not in the way that a bedroom is quiet or a library is quiet. It is full of sound, but it is a consistent sound, a sound that after the first hour or two of exposure begins to register not as sound but as the absence of silence, the way the sound of the sea always registers after you have been near it long enough to stop noticing it. The wind in the rigging, the creak of the masts, the slap of water against the hull, the occasional groan of timber working under load, all of this becomes a kind of white noise, a texture of sound that contains everything and nothing, and provides the background against which anything else that happens becomes audible by contrast. The cold on deck in February is a functional cold, a cold that requires management rather than simply endurance. You do not simply stand in it and wait for it to pass, the way you might stand in a light rain and wait for the cloud to move on. You move against it constantly, the small movements of a person managing their body temperature, the stamping of feet, the rubbing of hands, the pulling of coat closer, the turning of the face away from the wind to breathe air that has been slightly warmed by passing over the wool of your collar. The sailors who stood watch on winter nights in the Channel were not stoic in the sense of being indifferent to the cold. They were active in their management of it, because the alternative was the kind of cold that stopped a person functioning, which was something that a watch officer could not afford. The stars in a clear winter sky over the Channel are different from the stars you see from shore. On shore, there is always some ambient light, even on the darkest country night, enough to reduce the depth of the sky, to limit the number of stars visible, to soften the sharpness of what is there. At sea, in the middle of the Channel on a clear winter night, with no lights for miles in any direction, the sky is something else entirely. It is the full sky, the actual sky, the sky that existed before artificial light was invented, and that most people in the developed world have never seen and will never see. The stars go all the way down to the horizon. There are so many of them that the constellations that you might recognize from shore are difficult to find, because they are submerged in the surrounding density of stars that are not visible from shore. A sailor navigating by the stars was not using a few bright points of reference. He was reading a whole sky, a sky so dense with information that the skill of reading it was a real skill, something that took years to learn, and that was not fully learnable from books but only from experience, from standing on decks in the dark and looking up for thousands of hours until the sky became as readable as a landscape, as full of familiar features and reliable patterns as the shoreside world that the sailor had left behind. John Rivers was a navigator. He knew the sky the way navigators know it, from the inside, from below, from years of looking up. On the night of February the 1st, 1748, he was on a deck looking up at exactly that sky, with exactly that knowledge, and the knowledge told him where he was and what the course was and how far the sands were and what direction they lay in. He knew all of this as certainly as he knew anything. The sky was not ambiguous. The navigation was not in doubt. The Goodwins were exactly where they were, and he knew exactly where they were. And he turned the wheel anyway. This is the fact that the sky does not explain and the navigation cannot account for. The stars were there. The lightship was burning. The sands were marked. The knowledge was complete, and the wheel was turned. Not in ignorance, but in spite of knowledge, in spite of the complete and accurate understanding of what the consequences would be, in the particular extremity of a feeling that had grown larger than the knowledge and had, at least for the duration of those minutes at the helm, grown larger than everything else as well. The sea at night, if you have ever been on it, has a quality that daylight sea does not have, a quality of extension, of the world being larger than it is by day, of the horizon being further, of the darkness being not an obstruction, but an opening, a sense that what lies beyond the visible is more than what lies within it. This quality can be frightening in certain moods and in certain conditions, and it can be beautiful in others, and it can be something that is neither frightening nor beautiful, but simply the character of the world at that particular time, the world showing its night face, which is different from its day face the way all faces are different in the dark. The Channel at night is also a place of lights. There were, in 1748, fewer lights than there are today, but they were there. The lights of the lightships on the sands, the occasional light of a coastal settlement visible from the right position, the running lights of other vessels, the lanterns of fishing boats working the night. These lights made the dark more complex rather than less so, because each light was a reference point that demanded interpretation, a piece of information about what was out there and where it was and what it was doing. A sailor reads lights the way a city driver reads traffic. It is automatic, barely conscious, the continuous processing of a stream of information that requires constant updating and constant response. Which lights are moving and which are stationary, which are the right colour and which are wrong, which are in positions that make sense and which are in positions that require attention and possibly action. The lightship on the Goodwins was a fixed point, a known reference, a light that said, "Here is the danger, here is where you must not go." Rivers knew this light. He had seen it from this ship, from other ships many times before. He knew what it meant. The cabin below his feet was warm. He could not hear the conversation, not at this distance, not through the planking and the sound of the rigging and the sea. But he knew it was happening. He knew the captain was there, and the bride, and the guests, and the music, and the warmth. He knew all of this with the knowledge that comes from knowing a ship, from knowing where everything is and what it sounds like and what the warmth below a deck feels like when you're standing on the cold side of it. He knew the warmth was there and he was not in it. This is perhaps the most affecting image in the whole story, if you allow yourself to hold it for a moment. The first mate on the deck, in the cold, with the stars above him, and the warm cabin below him, knowing where he was and where the sands were and what he was doing or what the part of him that acts was doing, in the gap between the cold and the warmth, between the stars and the dark water, between the knowledge and the act. Standing there with the wheel in his hands and the cold coming off the sea and the celebration coming up through the planking as warmth that was not his to receive. The channel moved past him on both sides. The bow cut the water with the sound that bows make, that clean splitting sound that is one of the characteristic sounds of a sailing vessel underway. The sound of the ship meeting the sea and the sea yielding to the ship. This sound also would have been familiar to him, the sound of his working life, the sound of ships going where they were supposed to go. On that night, the sound was the same as always. The ship was going somewhere else. Let this image be the last clear image before the story begins its final descent into sleep and quiet. The deck at night, the cold, the stars, the warm light from below, the wheel, the dark water on both sides, the sands ahead. Let it be there in the imagination for as long as it wants to be there, and then let it soften, the way all images soften as sleep approaches, the edges going first and then the colour and then the shape, until what remains is not an image anymore but a feeling, not a scene anymore but a quality, the quality of the old cold channel and the patient sands and the story that has been told about them for longer than anyone currently alive has been alive. You are very nearly there. The story has been long, the water has been wide, and the place where the story is taking you is the same place all stories take you, eventually, if you stay with them long enough, which is the quiet place on the other side of the telling. The place that has no name but that has the quality of deep water, of the cold below the cold, of the dark below the dark, where the ships are kept and the sand is patient and the warmth of where you are is the warmth of being exactly where you're supposed to be. The superstitions of the sea are older than any of the superstitions of the land, older than most of the religions that eventually absorbed or replaced them, older than any written record that names them. They grew up in the gap between human intention and the sea's response to that intention, which is always and without exception the gap between what a person expects and what the sea delivers, and that gap is always significant, always instructive, always potentially fatal. In such a gap, belief fills the space that knowledge cannot reach. The sailors of the 18th century English commercial trade were not, in the main, uneducated men. They were, many of them, practical men of the kind that practical work produces, men who could read a chart and navigate by the stars and understand the mechanics of their ship and the behaviour of the weather, with a clarity and accuracy that was the product of experience rather than formal education. They were empiricists of a specific and demanding kind, empiricists whose errors had immediate physical consequences rather than merely intellectual ones. You cannot sail a ship on mistaken beliefs about the weather. The weather corrects you. And yet these same men carried a cargo of belief that was not empirically grounded, that could not be empirically grounded, because the things it addressed were in the category of things that empirical investigation does not reach. What happens after death, whether the dead have any continuing existence, whether the sea has a character that is something more than physics, whether there are forces in the world that are not mechanical, not predictable, not subject to the ordinary categories of cause and effect. About these things, the sailors believed what sailors had always believed, and what they believed was complicated and specific, and often at odds with the official theology of the churches they attended when they were in port. They believed that certain days were unlucky for starting a voyage. Friday was the classic unlucky day, and the avoidance of Friday departures was widespread enough to affect the scheduling of commercial voyages in ways that had real economic consequences. They believed that certain animals aboard a ship were omens, good or bad depending on the animal and the circumstances. A black cat was generally considered good luck aboard a ship, while a rabbit was considered unlucky, with the level of unluckiness attributed to rabbits being sufficient that some sailors would not say the word aloud, and referred to them instead as long ears or similar circumlocutions. They believed that whistling on a ship could raise a wind, which sounds like something you would want to be able to do when the wind had died and the ship was becalmed, but which was actually considered a dangerous ability that was more likely to raise more wind than you wanted rather than exactly the amount you wanted. The sea's provision of wind was, in this belief system, something that was better left to the sea's own judgment rather than summoned through human action, because the sea's judgment about appropriate amounts of wind was generally more conservative than what human whistling tended to produce. They believed in the portentousness of unusual natural events, in the significance of unusual animal behaviour, in the ominous quality of certain cloud formations and certain wave patterns. They believed, many of them, in the existence of things in the sea that the natural philosophers of the period were beginning to classify as mythology, but that the sailors who had spent their lives on the water were not ready to dismiss as mere superstition. The sea serpent, the kraken, the phenomenon of a ship becalmed in a perfectly circular area of still water surrounded by moving water, the ghost ship, these were things that the sea was understood to contain or to produce, and they were understood with a combination of fear and respect that was appropriate to things that were genuinely dangerous and genuinely unpredictable. Ghost ships occupied a specific place in this taxonomy of maritime belief. They were not, in the beliefs of the sailors who encountered or reported them, necessarily supernatural in the sense of being outside the natural order. They were, rather, part of a natural order that was understood to be wider and more complex than the natural order that the landside world generally acknowledged. The sea was a place where the ordinary rules were suspended or modified. The sea was a place where the dead continued to exist in some form, not in the vague general sense of the dead existing somewhere, but in the specific sense of the dead continuing to be present on the water where they had died, in forms that were accessible to the living under certain conditions. This belief was not confined to the uneducated or the credulous. It was widespread enough to influence the behaviour of experienced and competent officers, men who were perfectly capable of distinguishing between a mirage and a real vessel, between a natural optical effect and a genuine phenomenon, but who maintained, alongside their practical competence, a set of beliefs about the sea that was not reducible to that practical competence. The sea was too large and too old and too fundamentally indifferent to human life for its full character, to be captured by the navigation manuals and the meteorological tables and the chart corrections that constituted the technical knowledge of the period. The Lady Lovibond, when she began to appear in the accounts of people who worked the waters near the Goodwins, was received into this existing context of maritime belief. She was not a new category of thing. She was a new instance of a category that was already well established. The ghost ship, the vessel that has not arrived at its destination and continues to sail toward it long after the event that made arrival impossible. The specific details of her story, the wedding voyage, the jealous first mate, the date, the 50-year interval, were new. The underlying structure was as old as sailors going to sea and not always coming back. The Kent coast had its own tradition of maritime belief that was distinct in some particulars from the wider tradition, shaped by the specific character of the waters off Kent, by the Goodwins in particular, by the long history of rescue and salvage that had developed around the sands. The Deal boatmen were not people who feared the sea in the ordinary sense. They went out onto it in conditions that would have terrified most people, in the knowledge that conditions would get worse before they got better. What they had was not fear of the sea, but a respect for the sea that was so deeply ingrained that it had become something like a relationship, a working relationship with an entity that was enormously powerful and essentially unpredictable, and that demanded constant attention and constant adjustment. In this relationship, the beliefs about what the sea contained were part of the working knowledge rather than separate from it. To know the Goodwins was to know everything about them that was knowable, including the things that were not knowable in the ordinary sense, including the legend of the Lady Lovibond and the other stories that had accumulated around the sands over the centuries. These stories were not entertainment, exactly, or not only entertainment. They were part of the information that a person who worked those waters needed to have. The way knowing the depth of the water and the direction of the tides was information that a person needed to have. They were part of the landscape. The current generation of people who work near the Goodwins carries this tradition forward, in the attenuated and sometimes self-conscious way that people in the modern world carry traditions that have passed through the filter of rationalism and are now held at a slight remove from the unquestioning belief that would have characterized them in earlier periods. They know the Lady Lovibond story. They may or may not believe it in any strong sense, but they know it, and they know the sands, and they know that the sands have a character that exceeds what the chart coordinates and the sonar readings can fully capture, and they know this because they have worked there, and the working has taught them. The way working in any complex environment teaches you things that the formal description of that environment cannot convey. The sea teaches. This is perhaps the most consistent thing that people who have spent time on it say about it. The one point of agreement between those who love it and those who merely work it, and those who have a complicated relationship with both. The sea teaches, through the mechanism of consequence, through the immediacy and the scale of what it does when the lessons are not learned. The Goodwins have been teaching for 10,000 years. What they have taught is mostly the content of the archive they have built, the consequences of inattention, the consequences of overconfidence, the consequences of turning 2 degrees in the wrong direction on a clear February night with the lightship burning and the sands ahead. This is the oldest lesson. It is still being taught. It will be taught again in 2048, or whenever the next event occurs that adds to the accumulation of what the sands and the Lady Lovibond have been saying since the 1st of February, 1748, which is, some things do not end when they stop. Some actions continue to move through time in the form of their consequences. Some stories keep being told because the thing the story is about has not been resolved, and the telling is the only way that the resolution can be approached, even if it cannot be reached, even if the reaching is always and only the reaching itself, and the arrival is always and only more reaching. You have been reaching, through this telling, for something that is at the edge of what stories can deliver, which is the thing itself, the actual event, the actual feeling, the actual cold water of the February Channel. You cannot have that. Nobody can have that. What can be had is the story, which is the shadow of the thing itself, the shape it left in the imagination of everyone who heard it, and the shape it left in the world when it ended. And the shadow is long. The shadow is 270 years long, and it extends out over the Goodwins, over the cold water, over the sand and the ship under the sand, into whatever February is coming next. Here is something that the Lady Lovibond story does not usually invite its listeners to consider, because the story tends to focus on the ghost ship and the Goodwins and the mechanics of the haunting, the question of whether and when the ship appears, and what the witnesses see and how the sightings can be accounted for. What it tends to set aside is the shape of the original feeling, the feeling that the story says caused all of this, the feeling that is still supposedly at the wheel of that ship on February nights near the sands. Jealousy is a word that covers a great deal of territory that is not always well mapped, that includes landforms of very different character depending on where exactly in the territory you are standing. There is the jealousy of possession, the jealousy of someone who has a thing and fears its loss, the anxious, watchful jealousy that makes a person difficult to live with and makes every glance and every absence significant. And there is the jealousy of deprivation, the jealousy of someone who did not have a thing and who watches someone else have it, which is a different kind of feeling, darker and more patient. The jealousy of the person standing outside in the cold, watching through the window at the warmth inside. John Rivers had the second kind. He had had it for months, perhaps for years, the time before the story begins, the time before the wedding, the time when the feeling was growing in the background of his days without his consent and without his acknowledgement. He had not asked for it. He had not wanted it, or had not wanted to want it, which is a distinction that feelings do not tend to honour. The feeling had arrived and had established itself and had continued to grow, the way certain inconvenient growths continue to grow when they are not attended to, and the not attending to them. The decision to maintain the correct and stoic and capable exterior, while the interior was doing something quite different, had allowed it to reach a size and a pressure that the exterior could not finally contain. The wedding was the moment when the container failed. Not because of anything spectacular or dramatic, not because of any single event that could be identified as the breaking point in retrospect, but because the wedding was the point at which the possibility ended. Before the wedding, in the months of the courtship, there had been the abstract possibility that something might change, that the situation might resolve itself differently from how it was resolving, that the feeling had some future that was not simply the future of a feeling, that is carried silently until the person who carries it is too old or too tired to carry it anymore. After the wedding, the possibility was gone. The situation was resolved. The resolution was permanent. It is possible to feel some compassion for John Rivers, in the way that it is possible to feel compassion for anyone whose pain has led them to something terrible, without thereby excusing what was done or minimizing the suffering of those who died because of it. Compassion and condemnation are not mutually exclusive. The capacity to understand the shape of a feeling, even a feeling that led to destruction, does not require the conclusion that the destruction was therefore acceptable or inevitable. Rivers was not a victim. He was the person who made the choice, however unconscious, however desperate. But the feeling that preceded the choice was real, and it was human, and it is recognizable to anyone who has ever wanted something that they could not have and had to watch someone else have it. The Lady Lovibond legend, in the form it has taken over 2.5 centuries, makes John Rivers the villain of the story, which is appropriate in the sense that he was responsible for the deaths of everyone aboard. But it does not make him simply a villain, because ghost stories require the existence of something unresolved in the ghost, and what is unresolved in Rivers is not evil, but pain. Evil does not haunt. It ends with the ending of the evildoer, because evil is a choice and choices have endings. Pain haunts, because pain is not a choice and does not end when the person who felt it ends. What is haunting the Goodwin Sands, if anything is haunting the Goodwin Sands, is not the action of February the 1st, 1748. It is the feeling that preceded the action, the feeling that made the action possible, the feeling that was so much larger and older than the action, that the action was almost incidental to it. The wheel was turned by something that had been building for years, something that had never been spoken or acknowledged or brought into the light where it might have been examined and perhaps resolved. Things that are not brought into the light tend to grow in the dark, and what grows in the dark for long enough tends to eventually act, in one way or another, in ways that the person cannot always predict or control. The new Mrs. Reed was the object of the story rather than its subject. This is one of the ways in which the Lady Lovibond legend is a product of its time, of the 18th century, and its assumptions about women's roles in the stories of their own lives. She had a name that was not consistently recorded. She had feelings and opinions and a whole interior life that the story did not see fit to preserve. She became, in the legend, the prize, the thing that was wanted and the thing that was lost rather than the person who was destroyed. This is worth noting, not to correct the legend, because legends are not corrected, but to acknowledge the dimension of the story that is present as absence, the life that was there and then was not, and that the story does not attempt to render. She was on a wedding voyage. She was happy. She was in the warm cabin below the cold deck, and the ship was moving, and the celebration was continuing, and everything that was supposed to happen next was still in front of her. She did not know what was at the helm. She did not know what had been turning in the mind of the first mate through the months of her courtship, and through the wedding dinner, and through the first hours of the voyage. She was not given the chance to know. The knowing was withheld from her along with everything else, in the cold water of the February Channel, in the sand that the Goodwins made available to receive what was coming. And Captain Reed, who had not known either, who had been below decks being happy in the specific and temporary way of a man who has just married the woman he loves and is still in the first hours of that having happened, who had done nothing wrong except perhaps to not look more carefully at the person he had trusted with the helm, he is also in the legend as a kind of absence, present in his role as the husband and the captain and the man who went to the deck too late, and understood too late and could do nothing. The legend preserves them all in the way that legends preserve people, as types rather than individuals, as functions of the story rather than as the specific people they were, with their specific interior lives and their specific fears and their specific ways of being in the world. This is the price that people pay for becoming legend. They become clearer and simpler and more available to others, and in becoming available they lose the particular density of being a specific person in a specific moment with specific thoughts that nobody else can fully know. Under the Goodwins, in the cold, the specific people are still there, or what is left of them after 270 years in the sand. They are no longer clear, they are no longer simple, they are no longer available, they are whatever people become when time has finished with them, and the sea has had them, and the only thing that remains is what the story says about them, which is partial and shaped by the needs of the story, rather than by the reality of the people. The reality of the people is not accessible anymore. The story is what we have, and the story says that every 50 years the ship comes back to the sands, still on the same course, still with the yellow lanterns burning, still crewed by people who have no way to know that the outcome will be the same as it has always been. The story says that the 50 years might as well be 50 minutes, that whatever happened in the cold water of February 1748 is still happening, still unresolved, still playing itself out in the particular time of the legend, which is not linear time, not the time of years and generations and the accumulation of history, but the circular time of the event that cannot be completed. And the story says finally that it will happen again, because the 50 years are not yet up, or the 50 years are just now up, or the 50 years have just passed and something was seen near the sands by someone who has not yet written it down. The Goodwin Sands today are managed, insofar as such things can be managed, by a combination of technology and tradition. The automatic light buoys that replaced the crude lightships are maintained by Trinity House, which has been responsible for the safety of navigation around the British coast since its founding by Henry VIII in 1514, making it one of the older continuing institutions in British life, older than most of the things that the British think of as ancient. The buoys are checked and serviced on regular schedules. Their lights burn reliably through the winter nights. The sands are marked as comprehensively as they can be marked. Vessels that come to grief on the sands in the modern period generally do so not through ignorance of where the sands are, but through equipment failure, weather events beyond the capacity of the navigation systems to account for, or in some cases through, exactly the kind of human inattention that has always sent ships onto the Goodwins. The distraction of the man at the helm, the momentary failure of attention, the small deviation that compounds over distance into catastrophe. The sands are patient. The sands have always been more patient than the technology designed to avoid them. The RNLI lifeboat station at Ramsgate, which is the primary rescue station for incidents on the Goodwins, maintains a 24-hour watch and can launch within minutes of an emergency call. The lifeboats available today are capable of operating in sea states that would have made rescue attempts impossible in 1748, equipped with navigation systems and communications equipment and stabilization technology that makes them significantly more effective than anything the Dealhovelers could deploy. The rescue tradition of the Kent coast continues, transformed by technology, but not transformed in its essential quality, which is the willingness to go out into conditions that sensible people would avoid in order to help those who cannot help themselves. The fishing boats that work the edges of the sands are still there, smaller and less numerous than they were in the height of the fishing industry in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but still present, still working the productive margins of the bank where the feeding is good and the risk is familiar enough to be managed. The fishermen who work these waters today know the legend of the Lady Lovibond, the way they know the tides and the weather patterns and the locations of the hazards, as part of the operational knowledge of their environment, the background information that makes the foreground intelligible. Some of them, in the accounts that have been gathered by those interested in the Lady Lovibond legend, express the usual mixture of attitudes toward it: the pragmatic dismissal of a professional who deals in realities, the cultural pride in a local legend that gives their waters a particular character, and in some cases a more guarded acknowledgement that the sands are a place where unusual things happen and that they are not entirely dismissive of unusual things happening near them. The Goodwins have been doing unusual things for a very long time. A man who works those waters for decades develops a certain relationship with the unusual that is neither simple belief nor simple dismissal. The wreck archaeology of the sands has progressed considerably since the 1990 survey. Improved sonar technology and the development of remotely operated vehicles capable of working in the conditions at the sands have allowed researchers to build more detailed pictures of what lies beneath the sand, though the sand itself remains a significant barrier to detailed investigation. The Goodwins are a protected site under British maritime law, and any disturbance of the wrecks they contain requires permits and oversight that reflect the recognition of the sands as an archaeological resource of unusual significance. The wreck that the 1990s survey identified as potentially the Lady Lovibond has not been definitively identified. The archaeological evidence is consistent with an 18th century vessel of the appropriate size and type, but the evidence is not sufficient for a conclusive identification, partly because the sand covers too much of the hull for the identifying features to be accessible, and partly because documentary evidence about the Lady Lovibond's exact specifications is not detailed enough to allow a match against what the survey found. The ship may be there. The ship is probably there. Where else would it be? There is something quietly affecting about the existence of the wreck, about the knowledge that the physical remains of the Lady Lovibond are almost certainly somewhere under the Goodwin Sands, having been there for 2.5 centuries, preserved by the same cold and sand that the legend says keep something of her sailing still. The timbers of the ship that was a wedding vessel, that carried the captain and his new wife and the wedding guests and John Rivers, are somewhere in the sands, in the dark, in the cold, 4 miles from the coast of Kent. They have been there through every subsequent February. They were there in 1798, when the fisherman from Deal saw something near the sands. They were there in 1848, when the sailor on the coastal vessel saw the yellow lights. They were there in 1898, when the South Goodwin lightship log recorded the anomalous observation. They were there in 1948. They were there in 1998. They are there now. The legend and the wreck coexist in the same geography, without interfering with each other in any way that can be measured. The wreck is material, physical, subject to the ordinary processes of deterioration and preservation that all wrecks are subject to. The legend is something else, something that exists in language and memory, and the continuing capacity of human beings to find, in a 250-year-old maritime disaster, a story that speaks to something more current and more present than its date would suggest. Both are real in their respective registers. Both are there. Both will continue to be there. The Kent coast in February has its own quality of light, a quality that is distinct from any other season and from any other coast, the product of the specific latitude and the specific proximity of the water and the specific atmospheric conditions that February on the Channel produces. The light is low and sideways, coming from the south at an angle that makes everything it touches look as if it is being lit for an old painting, with long shadows and a warmth of colour that the February cold makes seem incongruous. The white cliffs of Dover, seen in this light from the water, have a quality of gold rather than white, catching the afternoon sun in a way that must have been the same in 1748, and will be the same long after anyone reading this story is gone. It is a good light for looking at water. It is a good light for noticing things on the surface of the sea that might not be noticed in the flat light of noon, or the darkness of full night. It is the light of the morning and the late afternoon, the light of the hours when the sands show themselves if they are going to show themselves, when the water above them is shallow enough to reflect the sky differently from the deeper water on either side, when the edges of the bank are sometimes visible as a slight change in the colour of the sea. In this light, on a February afternoon, with the cold coming off the water and the birds working the currents above the bank, it is easier to understand how people see things near the Goodwins that they cannot easily explain. The light is deceptive in the way that beautiful things are sometimes deceptive. It makes everything look more certain and more present than it is, makes distant things look closer, makes uncertain shapes look more defined. A patch of disturbed water above a shifting portion of the bank could look, in this light, like the wake of a vessel. A line of seabirds could look, at the edge of visibility, like something larger and more structured than it is. The people who have worked these waters for many years develop an eye for the difference, for the distinction between the real and the apparent, between what is there and what the light and the sea and the particular quality of February vision are constructing for the eye that wants to see something. But even experienced eyes are not immune to the construction. Even the most seasoned fisherman, the most practiced coastguard, the most sceptical maritime professional, can be surprised by the channel light in February, by the way it rearranges the surface of the water into shapes that the mind immediately reaches for names to attach to. There is a word in the older maritime literature for this phenomenon. the tendency of the eye at sea to see ships in things that are not ships, to construct masts and sails from the intersection of wave crests and cloud edges, and the particular way that low light falls on a disturbed surface. The word is not widely used anymore, but the phenomenon it describes persists, and the Goodwin Sands, with their particular combination of shallow water and atmospheric effects, and the long history of mariners looking toward them with a mixture of attention and dread, are among the best possible locations for the phenomenon to manifest. What is seen near the Goodwins on a February afternoon is never simply what is there. It is always what is there filtered through the quality of the light and the quality of the attention and the quality of the knowledge that the watcher brings to the watching. A person who knows the Lady Lovibond legend, who is near the sands on a February day, who is looking for something unusual, will see the usual things differently from a person who knows nothing of the legend and has no particular reason to expect anything unusual. The knowledge changes the seeing. This is not a weakness of human perception, but one of its oldest and most reliable features. What we know shapes what we see, and what we expect shapes what we find. The 1998 sighting, the fifth in the 50-year sequence, came from people who knew the legend and who were near the sands, specifically because of the anniversary. The accounts they produced were shaped by that knowledge, filtered through that expectation. This does not mean the accounts are false, it means the accounts are human, which is what all accounts of unusual observations are, human in their construction, human in their limitations, human in the way they sit between what happened and what was perceived and what was remembered and what was finally put into words. And perhaps, occasionally in this light on a February day near the date of the anniversary, something is there that is not quite accounted for by patches of disturbed water and lines of seabirds. Perhaps occasionally the legend and the material reality coincide in a way that is difficult to categorize, that resists the easy labels of real and not real, that sits in the uncertain middle ground where the most interesting things tend to sit. Perhaps the sands are patient. They are not interested in answering the question. They will be there in 2048, when the next 50 years are up, keeping whatever they keep, and if something comes back to the surface on that February night, the people who are there to see it will have to decide for themselves what to make of it, as every generation of watchers has had to decide, without the benefit of certainty, without the comfort of conclusive explanation, in the cold and the particular February light of the Kent coast. The year 2048 is not so far away as it might feel. The world in 2048 will be recognisable to the people who are reading this now, in the way that the world of 1998 is recognisable to people who remember 1998, which is to say, recognisable in its emotional texture, in the things that people care about and fear and hope for, even if the specific technologies and the specific political arrangements are different. The Goodwin Sands in 2048 will be exactly where they are now, exactly as deep and exactly as wide and exactly as patient as they have always been. They will not have moved, or will have moved only in the geological sense, which is a sense too slow for any human lifetime to register. Someone will be watching the sands in February of 2048. This is a near certainty, because someone watches the sands every February, the fishermen and the Coast Guard and the maritime professionals whose work takes them near the Goodwins regardless of the month and the anniversary. But in February 2048, some of the people watching will be watching specifically with the Lady Lovibond in mind, with the 50-year interval and the accumulated history of the legend creating the particular quality of attention that only a known anniversary produces. What they will see is not possible to say. What has been seen before in 1798 and 1848 and 1898 and 1948 and 1998 is the template, a vessel, or the appearance of a vessel, with yellow lanterns on an impossible course near the sands in the early days of February. Whether the template will be filled again in 2048 is the question that the legend perpetually poses and perpetually defers, the question that keeps the legend alive by refusing to be answered definitively in either direction. The answering, or the not answering, will happen in the particular February that is still ahead, the specific cold and specific dark and specific weather of a February morning or evening or night on the Channel, in conditions that will be what they will be, that cannot be predicted or controlled or arranged to fit the legend's requirements. If something appears, it will appear in the conditions that exist, not in the conditions that the legend specifies. The legend will be applied to the conditions afterward, the interpretation laid over the observation the way interpretations are always laid over observations, after the fact, with the benefit of the template already in place. This is how legends work and how they have always worked, not through the presentation of definitive evidence that demands belief, but through the accumulation of experiences that are compatible with belief, that can be interpreted through the lens of the legend, that fit the template well enough to be added to the archive of sightings without being definitive enough to settle the question. The accumulation continues, the archive grows, the question remains open, the story keeps being told. There is something almost comfortable about this, in the way that all long-term structures are comfortable, in the way that the knowledge of what will happen, even if what will happen is uncertainty, is better than the anxiety of not knowing even the shape of the uncertainty. The Lady Lovibond will be there in 2048, either as a sighting or as the absence of a sighting, as the story that generates attention or the story that generates disappointment, and either way the story will continue because the story does not require confirmation. It requires only the telling. The Goodwins in February of 2048 will smell the way the Goodwins in February have always smelled, which is the smell of deep sea mixed with the smell of shallow, the smell of sand and kelp, and the particular estuary quality of water that is close to the mouth of a great river, the Thames sending its freshwater scent south and east even to the sands 4 miles off the coast. The light will be the same winter light, low and sideways, that makes white things gold and gold things copper, and turns the water 100 shades of grey depending on the cloud cover and the angle of the sun, and the depth of the water below. A three-masted schooner, if one were to appear in that water in that light, would be a remarkable sight. There are no three-masted schooners in the commercial trade anymore, and there have not been for many decades. A three-masted schooner on the Channel in February of 2048 would be an anachronism in a way that a three-masted schooner on the Channel in February of 1798 would not have been, because 1798 was still the age of sail, still a time when a three-masted schooner was a working vessel rather than a historical artifact. By 2048, a three-masted schooner near the Goodwins would be, by definition, something from the past, something that did not belong to the present moment, something that had no business being there in the way that the present world constructs what has business being there. Which is precisely the description that every account of the Lady Lovibond sightings has provided. A vessel that has no business being where it is, doing what it is doing, in the conditions that exist. A vessel that is there and then not there, that does not respond to signals, that does not show up on instruments designed to detect vessels, that disappears when approached. A vessel that is, in every observable particular, a vessel from the past, from a specific past, from the evening of the 1st of February 1748, still sailing that evening, still on that course. Whether this is literally true, whether there is something on the water near the Goodwins on those February nights that corresponds to the description in the legend, is the question that will not be answered here, because it has not been answered anywhere, because the nature of the evidence is such that it supports both the possibility and the impossibility simultaneously, and because the story, in some important sense, does not require the question to be answered in order to continue being what it is. The people who will be watching in February 2048 are at this moment children or young people, some of them already fascinated by the sea, some of them unaware of the Goodwin Sands and the legend attached to them, some of them not yet born. They will arrive at the anniversary through paths that cannot be predicted, through family connection or professional duty, or the particular interest that leads certain people to the margins of the official record, to the folklore and the local knowledge and the accumulated testimony of ordinary people who saw something unusual and wrote it down, or told someone else who wrote it down. The legend will find them the way legends find the people who carry them forward, not through formal transmission, but through the casual, accidental, irresistible way that stories move through a culture. The instruments available in 2048 for detecting vessels will be considerably more sophisticated than anything available in 1998. The radar coverage of the channel approaches something very close to comprehensive already. The satellite positioning systems and the automatic identification systems that modern vessels are required to carry mean that the location and movement of every commercial vessel in the channel is tracked in real time and recorded. If a vessel were to appear near the Goodwins in February 2048 that was not transmitting a signal, that did not appear on radar, that was observed visually by the people watching but corresponded to nothing on any of the instruments. The record produced by that combination of observation and absence would be considerably more detailed and considerably harder to explain than any record produced by the previous sightings. This is the condition that awaits the legend in its next appearance, a world in which the absence of explanation is itself more carefully documented than it has ever been, a world in which the gap between what is seen and what is detected by instruments is narrower than ever, which means that anything visible but undetectable, anything registering on human perception but not on the array of sensors that modern maritime surveillance deploys, would be more anomalous in 2048 than it was in 1798, when the absence of a vessel on any other ship's manifest was simply the normal condition of maritime uncertainty. The Sands will receive whatever comes to them in 2048 with the same equanimity they have always shown. They are not interested in the question of whether the legend is true. They are not interested in providing evidence. They are interested only in what they have always been interested in, which is the patient work of being what they are, the 4 miles of shifting sand in the shallow water off the Kent coast, the place where the channel narrows and the tidal currents meet and the history accumulates in layers that no instrument has yet fully mapped. What the story requires is the telling, and the telling requires the listener, and the listener is you in whatever particular February or not February, in whatever particular time of night or day you find yourself in, warm or not warm, sleepy or not sleepy, in whatever room or bed or chair the story has found you in. You have been here for all of this, the wedding, and the first mate, and the Goodwins, and the 50-year returns, and the lightship log, and the fisherman from Deal, and the Coast Guard officer, and the archaeology, and the questions that do not get answered, and the images that do not fully resolve into certainty. You have carried all of this through the telling, and now the telling is settling, the way all long journeys settle when the destination is in sight, when the last miles are being covered, when the thing that was ahead is becoming the thing that is here. The destination is sleep if it was not already here, and sleep is not far. The warmth around you is the warmth it has been throughout, unchanged, reliable, the background against which the cold of the February Channel became comprehensible and interesting rather than merely cold. The Lady Lovibond is on her course, she is always on her course, and you have been with her for all of it, from the quay at Gravesend to the dark water above the Goodwins, from the wedding morning to the night that followed it, from 1748 to whatever year is outside the window of wherever you are. You know the story now, you carry it now, and the carrying is its own form of keeping, the human form, the form that does not require sand or cold water, only memory and the willingness to pass the story on. February is coming, the sands are patient. The light on the water is the light on the water, and it will be the same light in 2048 as it is now, as it was in 1748. The same winter light that makes everything look as if it is being seen for the last time, or perhaps for the first time, which is the quality that certain light has when it comes off the sea in a particular season. That quality of everything being exactly as it is, nothing more and nothing less, just the world in its plain and irreducible existence. The water and the sand and the sky and the cold and the story that someone is still telling somewhere about a ship that went down on a February night and has been coming back ever since. There is a kind of time that ghost stories inhabit that is different from the time of ordinary events, different from the time you measure in hours and years and the accumulation of history. It is a time that is more like the time of the sea, which is always the same time and always a different time, which has its tides and its seasons and its long geological rhythms, without those rhythms adding up to the kind of progression that history requires, the kind of movement from past to present to future that gives ordinary time its sense of direction and its sense of purpose. The Lady Lovibond has been in both kinds of time since 1748. In ordinary time she is historical, she is 270-something years ago. She is ancient enough that no one alive can claim any direct connection to the people involved, ancient enough that the event exists entirely in the documentary record and the oral tradition, rather than in anyone's living memory. In ordinary time, she is over, concluded, done, the way all events are done once enough time has passed and all the people who are present have dissolved into whatever comes next. In ghost story time, she is still there, still sailing, still on the same course, with the same yellow lanterns and the same three masts and the same first mate at the helm, who has been at the helm for all this time and will be at the helm for all the time that comes after, because ghost story time does not allow for the kind of movement that ordinary time allows, the kind of movement that would let John Rivers step away from the wheel and stop being the person who turned it, and become instead someone who is simply gone. This is perhaps the most interesting thing about the Lady Lovibond legend when you hold it up to the light and turn it slowly. It is a story about the impossibility of escape from what you have done. Not in the moral or legal sense, because Rivers escaped legal consequences immediately by dying in the same moment and in the same water as everyone else who was aboard. He escaped in the ordinary sense without difficulty. What he did not escape, what the legend says he has not escaped in 270 years, is the doing of it, the action itself, the moment of the turned wheel, the course laid for the sands, the ship coming to rest in the cold water. Ghost stories are very often, at their deepest level, stories about consequences that outlast the event. They are stories about the impossibility of undoing, about the permanence of certain kinds of damage, about the fact that some actions make changes to the world that do not resolve themselves with the passage of time but continue to be present in the world in one form or another, whether as the haunting of a specific location by the specific feeling associated with what happened there, or as the way that the story of the event changes the way people understand and feel about that location forever afterward. The Goodwin Sands are a place associated with loss in a way that goes back much further than the Lady Lovibond. The 2,000 ships, the tens of thousands of people, the vast archive of human cargo that the sands have accumulated over the centuries, all of this creates a quality that the location carries, a weight of the gone, a density of the lost. The Lady Lovibond is part of this, but she is also more particular than the aggregate, more specific, more named. The way a story is always more specific and more named than the statistics it lives inside. What the legend adds to the sands, to the general quality of loss that they carry, is the quality of intention. Most ships that went onto the Goodwins went onto them because of storms, because of equipment failure, because of the darkness and the complexity of navigating those waters in earlier centuries when the tools were limited and the charts were incomplete. The Lady Lovibond went onto them because someone chose, in whatever degree of consciousness and intention, to turn the wheel. This makes her different. This gives her story a quality that the aggregate loss of the sands does not have, a human cause, a specific feeling that created a specific consequence. And it makes her particularly available to the imagination, because intention is comprehensible in a way that storms and equipment failure are not. We understand why John Rivers turned the wheel, even if we do not understand it in the sense of finding it acceptable. We understand the landscape of feeling that produced the action, because most people who have felt the feelings involved, love unrequited and loss borne silently over time, and the moment when the bearing of it finally exceeds the capacity to bear it, know those feelings from the inside, know what they look like from where they live. This is perhaps why the Lady Lovibond keeps being told. Not because ghost ships are inherently interesting, though ghost ships are interesting, and not because the Goodwin Sands are inherently interesting, though the Goodwin Sands are interesting, but because the feeling at the centre of the story is a feeling that has not become historical in the way the event has become historical. The feeling is still available. The feeling is still present in the world, in the sense that feelings are always present in the world, waiting for the circumstances that call them forward. The Lady Lovibond is an old story about a feeling that is not old. Let yourself settle a little deeper into the story, or into the comfortable place that is receiving the story, or into the quiet that lies on the far side of the story, just past where the narrative ends and the sleep begins. The water is out there still, the channel in the dark, the sands patient under their tide. You do not need to be on them. You are here, warm. The story like a light going out slowly. The way good light goes out, not suddenly but by degrees, the room growing gently darker without the moment you could identify as the moment the light stopped. The Lady Lovibond is on her course. She is always on her course. 4 miles east of Deal, in the dark water above the Goodwins, something moves that is not quite a ship and not quite a memory, that has the yellow lanterns and the 3 masts and the impossible course, that appears when the 50 years are up and disappears when it has made its point, which is the same point it has been making since 1748, that some things do not end when they stop, that some events continue in the world in the form of the feeling that produced them, that the Goodwins have something, and the something is still there, and the returning is part of the having. The sea is the oldest thing that you can look at. The sea has been on this planet for 4 billion years, and in those 4 billion years it has not changed its essential character, which is the character of something immeasurably deep and immeasurably old and patient in a way that no human concept of patience can quite contain. The Channel is a shallow sea, relatively a geological accident, a flooded plain that was dry land in the last ice age when the Thames ran all the way to the Rhine across a tundra plain that is now underwater. Even the Channel, the shallowest of seas, is older than anything the human record contains. It was here before the Goodwins, and it will be here after the Goodwins are gone, whenever they are gone, in whatever geological future that happens in. The ship is a small thing against all of that. The story is a small thing against all of that. A schooner and a wedding and a jealous first mate, and a cold February night on the Channel, all of it smaller than a sentence in the accounting of the sea's time. And yet the story is the size it is, the size of a human story, which is the only size that means anything to us, and in that human size it is very large. It contains everything: love, jealousy, betrayal, death, the persistence of guilt, the patience of the sands, the question of whether anything returns, and if it does return, what it comes back as. These are large questions to be carrying into sleep. Let them go now, or let them come with you in the light form that questions take when they move from the waking mind to the dreaming mind. The form of a feeling rather than a thought, an atmosphere rather than an argument. Let the ship be out there on the water, in whatever form it has, and let the water be the water, and let the dark be the dark, and let the questions drift along with the current that carries everything eventually to wherever everything eventually goes. Every legend that survives long enough becomes its own kind of object, an object that is made not of wood or iron but of language, not of physical material, but of the particular human capacity to hold information in the form of story rather than in the form of data. The Lady Lovibond, after 270 years of being told, is such an object. She is the story now more than she is the ship, though the ship is there, in the sand, in the cold. She is the thing that people carry when they carry the name, the accumulation of all the tellings, all the accounts, all the anniversary observations, all the questions that have been asked about her and that have not been answered. This is not a diminishment. It is, if anything, an amplification. The physical ship, the actual Lady Lovibond that sailed out of Gravesend on February the 1st, 1748, and came to rest on the Goodwin Sands that night, is beyond the reach of any living person, beyond seeing or touching or knowing directly. It is in the past, which is a country with no roads back, no means of direct access, no possibility of first-hand investigation. What can be investigated is the story, and the story is larger than the ship, contains more than the ship, has been shaped by more hands and more minds than the ship ever encountered. The story has been told in local pubs in Deal and Ramsgate for 200 years. It has been told in newspaper articles and in books of Kent folklore and in television documentaries about ghost ships and the Goodwins. It has been told on the internet, in the form of websites and forums and video essays and podcasts, each telling shaped by the medium and the moment of its telling, but recognizable as the same story, the same ship, the same sands, the same yellow lanterns, the same impossible course. The story moves through time the way the tide moves through the channel, changing its surface character with the conditions but maintaining its essential movement, its direction, its relationship to the deep. There is a passage in the older maritime literature about the Goodwin Sands that describes them as a place where time behaves differently, where the accumulation of so much history in such a small geographic area creates a kind of density, a compression of the past that makes the boundary between what has happened and what is happening less clear than it is in less historically saturated locations. This is not a supernatural claim. It is a claim about the quality of attention that certain places demand. The way that being in a place where important things have happened makes you aware of those things having happened, makes the past more present, makes the distance between then and now feel smaller than it does elsewhere. The Goodwins have this quality to a degree that few places match. 4 miles of sand, 4 miles of submerged history, more ships and more people than any other comparable location on Earth. When you're on the water near the Goodwins, you're on the water above all of that, above the 2,000 ships and the tens of thousands of people and the centuries of loss and salvage and rescue and catastrophe. The water above the sands is, in this sense, a kind of memorial without a memorial, a place that holds an enormous quantity of the gone without any of the formal apparatus that we usually use to acknowledge the gone. The Lady Lovibond is part of this memorial without a memorial. She's one of the named ones, one of the few ships in the Goodwin's enormous archive that has a story attached to her name, a story that makes her particular rather than merely statistical. The other 2,000 ships are there too, in the sand, unnamed or at least unnarratable, their stories lost with the people who knew them. The Lady Lovibond is the one who kept her story, or whose story kept her, which amounts to the same thing in the end. There is a quality that certain stories possess that makes them difficult to release, a quality that has something to do with the particular combination of event and character and place that they contain, the way the event is located in a geography that persists, and a character whose motive remains partially obscure, and a place that continues to be there, available to be visited, available to be stood near and looked at and felt in the February cold. The Lady Lovibond has all of these things: the geography of the sands, which anyone can approach, the character of John Rivers, whose grief and fury remain incompletely explained, the event of the wreck, which is documented if not precisely located, and the structure of the 50-year return, which gives the story a temporal dimension that no other maritime legend of the Goodwins possesses. The 50-year structure is perhaps the most important element of the legend's durability. A story that merely happened, that occurred on a particular date and ended there, is a story about the past, about something that is over. A story with a 50-year return is a story about the future as well as the past, a story that has not yet finished happening, that is still in process, that will produce new events in new Februaries that are still ahead. This is a story that people alive today have reason to pay attention to, not because they lived through 1748, but because 2048 is approaching, because the 50 years are counting, because the anniversary will arrive whether or not anyone is prepared for it. The stories we tell about the sea are different from the stories we tell about other things, different in the particular way they deal with absence. The sea is a place of absolute disappearance. Things that go into it do not come back, except in story, except in the form of the legend that stands in for the physical object that cannot return. The Lady Lovibond, the physical ship, did not come back from the Goodwins. The timbers are in the sand. The people who are on board that night are in the same cold dark where they have been for 2.5 centuries. What returns, if anything returns, is something made of story, made of the particular kind of persistence that stories have, made of the willingness of human beings to tell the same thing again and again because the telling is itself a form of keeping the gone close. This is what you have been doing in the listening, keeping the gone close. The wedding couple on the Lady Lovibond, the captain who was happy that day, the new wife who trusted the ship to carry her safely, the guests who were there for the celebration. They are as close as they can be right now, while the story is in the air, while the telling is happening. Closer than they will be when the story ends and the silence comes in, and the ordinary business of being where you are and thinking what you think resumes. In the telling, they are here. In the listening, you are there. And the distinction between then and now, between the February of 1748 and the February or not February of wherever you are, becomes briefly, gently, usefully unclear. What you have been carrying through this telling, through the cold open and the wedding departure from Gravesend and the character of the sands and the weight of John Rivers at the helm and the accounts of each successive 50-year return, is a collection of images and feelings that will settle differently in different minds, that will leave different residues in different memories, that will mean different things to different people, depending on what they bring to the listening. This is the nature of stories. They are not fixed objects. They are encounters between the material of the telling and the material of the listener, and what is produced in those encounters is always something slightly different from what was in either one alone. Perhaps what you carry away is the image of the yellow lanterns in the February dark. Perhaps it is the feeling of the cold above the sands. Perhaps it is something about love and what it does when it is not returned, about the things that accumulate in the dark when they are not brought into the light, about the consequences that do not end when the event ends. Perhaps it is simply the image of the ship on its endless course, the sails full, the course set, the sands ahead, and the helmsman unable or unwilling to turn the wheel in any other direction. The story asks a question that it does not answer, the way the best stories ask a question without answering it, leaving the answer in the space between the story and the listener, in the silence that follows the last word. The question is this: what, if anything, returns? Not just the ship. What, if anything, in the entire immensity of human experience and human feeling returns? Does the feeling outlast the event? Does the event leave something in the place where it happened that persists after the event is over? Does the love that turned the wheel still have the wheel in its hands on February nights, 4 miles east of Deal, in the dark water above the sand? Every generation that has carried the Lady Lovibond legend has brought this question with it, has sat with it in the way that you are sitting with it now, has found in the question something that the available answers do not quite satisfy. The scientific answer that light refracts in unusual ways over shallow tidal banks, that grieving minds project the shapes they are looking for onto the ambiguous surfaces of the sea, is not wrong. But it does not answer the question the way the question wants to be answered, which is not with an explanation but with a recognition, an acknowledgement that the question itself has weight, that the things we want to return, the people and the feelings and the moments that we wish had not ended, are real in their weight even if they are absent in their presence. The legend keeps the question alive by refusing to resolve it. The 50-year structure is not a resolution. It is a deferral, a promise that the question will return, will be asked again, will be available for the next generation to sit with and wonder over and eventually pass on to the generation after that. The unanswered question is the engine of the story's survival. A story that answered its own question would be finished. The Lady Lovibond is not finished. She will not be finished in 2048 or in 2098 or in any February that the story reaches, as long as the story keeps being told. You do not need to answer this question tonight. You do not need to answer it at all. You can simply hold it in the comfortable way that the half-asleep mind holds things it is not required to resolve, the easy, loose-handed way of not quite sleep, where the questions are present but not insistent, where the stories are present but not demanding, where everything is available without anything being urgent. The ship is out there on the water, the sands are under the ship, the cold is in the water and in the air above the water and in the story, and in the distance between 1748 and wherever you are now, which is a long distance, a distance longer than any ship has sailed. And the story has brought you this far, through all of that distance, through the wedding and the wreck and the returning, and the legend and the question at the end of the legend, and now the story is settling, the way the ship settled into the sand gently without drama, into whatever comes after the last word. The question is there if you want it. The warmth is there if you need it. Both are yours, neither is going anywhere. The lanterns are burning, the course is set, the Goodwins are patient. The story has done what stories do, which is to carry you somewhere you could not have reached alone, and to leave you there in the good dark, in the warmth that is still yours, with the sound of the water fading now into the sound of wherever you are, which is quiet, which is still, which is the beginning of the rest that the story has been carrying you toward from the first word to the last. You are warm, you are safe, you are very nearly asleep. And somewhere out on the black water of the February Channel, or in the place where the February Channel lives in the memory and the imagination of everyone who has ever heard this story, the Lady Lovibond is on her course, and the course is the same course it has always been, and she's very nearly home, and home is not a port and not a harbour, but simply the end of this telling, the quiet place where the story delivers you, and then withdraws, as all good stories withdraw, leaving you with the warmth of the having been told and the silence of the not needing to know anything more tonight. The story is over, the telling is done, and all that remains is the quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a long story, after the words have stopped and the images are still there but softening now, losing their edges, becoming more like feelings than images, more like the temperature of the room than like specific things you could describe. Let your body go heavy. You have been carrying it all day through all the ordinary demands of being a person in the world, and now there is nothing required of it, nothing that needs to be done with it, nowhere it needs to go. It can rest. It is resting. The weight of it is settling into whatever surface you're on, and the surface is accepting the weight without difficulty, the way good surfaces accept weight, without resistance, without effort, simply holding. The water is out there somewhere, the channel, the sands, the February dark. But it is very far away now, the way all stories become far away when the listening is done, when the attention releases its hold on the images, and the images begin to dissolve back into the neutral dark from which stories come and to which they return. The yellow lanterns are very faint now, the ship is very far, the sands are very still, as they are always still, in the patient way of very old and very deep things. Your breath is slowing. In, slowly. Out, slowly. In, with the cool of the room. Out, with the warmth of the body. In and out, the simplest pattern, the oldest pattern. The pattern that was there before. You knew any words, before you knew any stories, before you knew anything except the breath and the warmth and the dark. The cold of the channel is not your cold. The cold of February is not your February. You are warm. You are in the story's aftermath, in the comfortable residue of a long telling, in the place where the images have become gentle, and the feelings have become soft, and there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to understand, only the warmth and the dark and the breath. The Lady Lovibond is on the water. She is always on the water. And you are here, very still now, very quiet, your thoughts growing slower and softer and further apart, the intervals between them growing longer, the way the intervals between sounds grow longer in the late night, the way the world grows quieter as the hours move toward morning. There is nothing you need to do. There is nothing you need to remember. There is nothing you need to resolve or understand or carry forward. The story has been told. You have been here for the telling, and now the story is doing what stories do when they are done, which is becoming part of the deep background of the mind, the accumulated furniture of all the stories ever heard, settling into its place among the other things you know, without quite knowing how you know them, the things that are simply there in the background, part of the texture of being the person you are. Sleep is very close now. You can feel the edge of it, the way you feel the edge of water before you step in, the particular quality of the air just before the change. You are at the edge, you are at the very edge. The water is warm, the dark is safe, and the story is behind you now, delivered, complete, settled into the sand of the mind the way the ship is settled into the sand of the Goodwins, quietly, permanently held. Let go. The water is warm, the dark is yours, and the ship, very far away now, very faint, is on her course in the February Channel, and she is beautiful, and she is old, and she is yours to dream. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I am always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. Do you believe the Lady Lovibond still sails the Goodwin Sands every 50 years, and what do you think drives her back?